Distinși colegi, organizarea unei conferințe științifice închinată amintirii marelui savant Emil Racoviță este un prilej de celebrare și pentru Academia Română, care l-a primit în rândurile ei ca membru corespondent încă în 1905, și pentru Universitatea, pe vremea aceea națională a Daciei Superioare, Universitatea Babeș-Bolyai, care l-a primit în rândul corpului ei profesoral încă de la înființare în 1919. Prin urmare, viața și activitatea lui Emil Racoviță reprezintă un subiect de interes special, deosebit pentru toată lumea savantă, dar în principal pentru aceste două instituții care, de altfel, la 75 de ani de la trecerea la cele veșnice, îi cinstesc memoria. Emil Racoviță a fost o efigie a științei mondiale, o personalitate care a lăsat în urmă Franța ca să se mute în noua Românie întregită, în inima Transilvaniei, unde se pregăteau, aflase el, performanțe științifice și didactice de prim rang. El a făcut parte din generația care, după primul război mondial, s-a întors să-și aducă a sa contribuție la instruirea tinerilor. Țara era în concepția lor, a membrilor acestei generații, comunitatea. Iar dacă această comunitate se potrivea și cu locul de naștere și de îngropare a părinților și moșilor, atunci ea se chema patrie. Emil Racoviță a fost un astfel de savant român care n-a cerut niciodată nimic de la patrie, dar care a răsplătit patria cu toată știința lui. E de prisos să adăugăm aici toate calitățile sale, cu totul speciale, toate onorificențele, premiile, toate alegerile lui în diferite organisme naționale și internaționale. E de ajuns să ne amintim că a fost rector al Universității din Cluj, devenită Universitatea Regele Ferdinand I, începând cu anul 1927, și a fost președinte al Academiei Române. A străbătut etapele științei mondiale pe care a ilustrat-o cu atâta curaj, speologia, biospeologia, cu dezvoltură, și a invitat în țară, deopotrivă la Universitatea din Cluj și la Academie, membrii marcanți ai comunității științifice mondiale. Activitatea lui nu a fost destinată doar prezentului pe care l-a trăit, cu acea conștiință vie că face istorie, ci mai ales viitorului. Cărturarul a pus temeiurile unei biologii, să zicem în linii mari, a urmașilor săi. S-a ocupat de mediul sănătos, de parcurile naturale, de protecția naturii, intuind parcă asalturile destructive care aveau să vină, mai ales în deceniile din urmă. Emil Racoviță a lăsat posterității un mesaj luminos, un mesaj aureolat de câteva legăminte. Unul a fost acela al rectorului savant de prestigiu, el înțelegând că autoritatea nu vine din autoritarism, ci din soliditatea creației științifice. Din acest motiv a fost respectat și iubit de toți colaboratorii săi. Un altul se referă la încrederea că biruința valorii, într-o vreme când puțin vedeau forța intelectuală și reușita a științei românești, că biruința valorii autentice vine până la urmă. Prin activitatea lui Emil Racoviță și a generației sale de profesori, de savanți, deopotrivă Universitatea și Academia au avut de câștigat și au ajuns la performanțe extraordinare în anii de glorie ai creației sale. Pentru aceasta se cuvine să afle și contemporanii noștri mai tineri, cu precădere studenții, că cei care ne-au precedat au fost savanți, intelectuali de prim rang, care au știut să-și îndeplinească menirea și să aducă un plus de cunoaștere în cadrul științei românești și universale. Emil Racoviță a fost cu prisosință unul dintre aceștia, fapt pentru care ne închinăm memoriei lui și îi aducem un omagiu cu totul special în aceste zile. Vă mulțumesc!
Here. Therefore, the next speaker is going to be the president of the Babeș-Bolyai University, Professor Daniel David. Please.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to see all three organizations involved in this event, namely the Romanian Academy, the new foundation dedicated to Emil Racoviță, and also the Babeș-Bolyai University, or the UBB, how we call it. We are all here to honor the scientific legacy of Emil Racoviță. I'm not going to enter into details or in a long speech. I would just want to point out to several ideas which are important for this legacy from our perspective, from the perspective of Babeș-Bolyai University. First of all, I would say, or the first idea is related to the fact that Emil Racoviță was related to the Romanian academic area long time before he decided to return in the country. Since 1905, he was a member of Romanian Academy, for example. At that moment, he was already famous after the expedition of Belgica. So he was related to the Romanian academic community. The second idea is related to the fact that when he returned in Romania, he didn't just return in Cluj, he practically came to the university in Cluj, where he was professor, and in time he was director of the university. So practically Emil Racoviță, as a director of the university, is still honored today in the gallery of directors. Also, I have in my office, for example, a large picture of him together with Queen Marie, who got the Doctor Honoris Causa of the university under his rectorate. And also he's one of the few rectors of the university who has a statue. So he's very much honored in the university. The third idea is related to what he accomplished in the university. We all know that he founded the first institute of speology in the world, but many people just mention that this institute was founded in Cluj. This is true, but at the same time, we should say that the institute was founded in the university in Cluj, not just somewhere in the Cluj. So practically the first institute of speology was founded in the University of Cluj by Emil Racoviță. Also very important, he practically moved his whole field, or the research he initiated in the field of biospeology, a new field defined in a way by Emil Racoviță. He moved this field in the university in Cluj, in the Institute of Speology. So in this way, the University of Cluj became at that time the world center for the new field started by Professor Racoviță. And this is a very important aspect, and a very important, not only scientific aspect, but also historical aspect. And the fourth idea is related to the fact that under the communist period, the university in Cluj was reorganized. So practically, for example, many institutes were just closed. This was not the case with the Institute of Speology. We don't have a formal action trying to close the Institute of Speology. However, the new authorities just didn't pay attention to this institute in the university. However, the field was organized outside of the university under the umbrella of the Romanian Academy of Science, where in a way the field developed very well, and today we have an institute there dedicated to speology and to Emil Racoviță, which is a pretty prestigious one at the national and international level. Thus, that institute also continuing the legacy, the scientific legacy of Emil Racoviță. However, in 2020, we decided to re-establish the institute of initiated by Emil Racoviță in Babeș-Bolyai University. However, we tried to do that in the new context, trying to bring his legacy in present and also to use it for future. That is why we call that institute Institute for the Study of Life in Extreme Conditions. So in a way, we started from biospeology, but we expanded the scope and the aim of the institute. So in this way, practically, we can study the life from the bottom of the oceans to, I don't know, through land to the space. We even have there a component which is related to psychology. I'm a psychologist. I coordinate the center in the institute which is related to psychology, because studying the life in extreme conditions is a very important topic for what is happening today. For example, today humans are facing climate changes, wars, and a lot of other major problems. So I think that psychology has a lot to do in this investigation. For example, we started the whole line of research in the Psychology Center in a PhD work, which is still ongoing, in which we try, for example, to reanalyze the notes of Emil Racoviță and his journals during the Belgic expeditions. And we try to understand what was happening at that time through the modern psychological theories like psychology of resilience, modern stress theories, and so on. So to make a long story short, the spirit of Emil Racoviță is still very much alive in the university. Joking seriously, I could say that I meet his spirit each morning in my office, because, as I said, I have a large picture of Emil Racoviță there, and also his scientific legacy is well represented by the new institute of UBB. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to see, this conference dedicated to his memory and also to his scientific legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next and the last of the opening remarks belongs to Professor Academician Octavian Popescu. He's the president of the newly formed Emil G. Racoviță Foundation. Professor?
Thank you. Honored guests, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, my presentation will be in English, but I will speak in Romanian. Fundația Emil G. Racoviță pentru Știință și Explorarea Mediilor Extreme a fost înființată sub egida Universității Babeș-Bolyai din Cluj-Napoca ca omagiu adus lui Emil G. Racoviță pentru a întări și dezvolta poziționarea academică internațională a savantului și a domeniilor de explorare și cercetare fondate de acesta. A fost constituită de un grup de oameni de știință și exploratori din țară, în principal Universitatea Babeș-Bolyai, Academia Română, și din străinătate, împreună cu familia savantului Emil G. Racoviță. Viața și activitatea savantului Emil G. Racoviță, președinte al Academiei Române între 1926 și 1929, 3 mandate consecutive, și punerea în valoare a realizărilor sale și a concepției sale despre explorare, știință, cunoaștere, pace și colaborare internațională sunt un exemplu pentru fundamentarea scopurilor și obiectivelor fundației și sunt în deplin acord cu misiunea Universității Babeș-Bolyai din Cluj-Napoca și a Academiei Române în alte foruri naționale de consacrare științifică și culturală ale țării, piloni ai cercetării fundamentale în România, participanți activi în viața societății românești și simboluri ale spiritualității naționale. Personalitatea lui Emil G. Racoviță este o sursă de inspirație pentru atragerea tinerilor spre zona de cercetare științifică, pentru colaborarea internațională, revigorarea expedițiilor științifice și explorarea mediilor extreme și necunoscute. Astfel, Fundația Emil G. Racoviță își propune să contribuie la dezvoltarea cercetării științifice în România și la păstrarea și valorificarea patrimoniului național. Fundația Emil G. Racoviță are următoarele scopuri principale: onorarea moștenirii savantului Emil G. Racoviță, întărirea și dezvoltarea poziției academice internaționale a savantului Emil G. Racoviță și a domeniilor de cercetare fondate de acesta, consolidarea și internaționalizarea peisajului academic și de cercetare din România, precum și ale politicilor culturale și educaționale românești. Și al 4-lea obiectiv principal, integrarea tratatelor, acordurilor, convențiilor și altor înțelegeri internaționale în care România este parte, cum ar fi, de exemplu, Tratatul Antarcticii, Comitetul Științific pentru Cercetări Antarctice, SCAR, și care, prin obiectivul lor, privesc și mediile extreme pentru accesul la resurse necunoscute, conservarea mediului ambient și stimularea cercetării avansate de frontieră. Obiectivele specifice ale Fundației privesc inițierea de evenimente dedicate realizărilor savantului Emil G. Racoviță, expediției Belgica, cercetării și explorării peșterilor, biospeologiei și evoluționismului. Onorarea moștenirii savantului Emil G. Racoviță și prin organizarea de manifestări științifice internaționale dedicate cercetării de frontieră a mediilor extreme, promovarea cercetării mediilor extreme, oceanic, subteran, polar, spațial, implicarea în activitățile privind ocrotirea naturii în general și conservarea biodiversității în ariile naturale protejate și ocrotirea speciilor periclitate în special. Sprijinirea dezvoltării tehnologice a metodelor care permit explorarea unor medii naturale și antropice neinvestigate până în prezent sau puțin explorate. Crearea unei rețele de colaborare de excelență care să conecteze cercetarea românească din domeniile cercetării mediilor extreme și al ocrotirii naturii cu entități recunoscute la nivel mondial. Realizarea de expediții și cercetări în zona arctică prin participarea la programele comunității europene, de exemplu Svalbard Integrated Arctic Earth Observing System, European Union Plate Observing System sau la programe bilaterale cu diferite țări din Europa și de pe glob. Susținerea evenimentelor științifice dedicate cercetării în medii extreme. Susținerea și promovarea relațiilor interinstituționale și ale cercetărilor inter- și multidisciplinare, implicând instituțiile academice, industria și alți factori de interes pentru realizarea de proiecte, având drept țintă studierea, explorarea, cercetarea și valorizarea mediilor extreme. Susținerea inițiativelor privind biodiversitatea, a serviciilor ecosistemice pe care le oferă capitalul natural, astfel încât să se asigure că acestea sunt ocrotite, evaluate și restaurate corespunzător pentru valoarea lor intrinsecă și contribuție esențială la bunăstarea și prosperitatea umane, evitând modificările catastrofale cauzate de pierderea biodiversității. I would like to end with Emil Racoviță timeless definition of science. Sfios, dar cu incorrigibilul meu nărav de naturalist de a spune tot ce sunt convins că este adevărul, trebuie să mărturisesc că, la întrebarea ce mi-am pus, ce se ascunde sub numele de știință, am răspuns, nimic. Prin urmare, o entitate bine definită ce s-ar putea numi știință nu există. Totuși, există ceva sub acest nume popular, ceva ce sub acest nume popular înrăurește adânc soarta omenirii, ceva a cărui ființă și istorie umple mii de cărți, ceva cu care mii de dascăli împărtășesc mii de învățății. Ei, ce e acel ceva și cum să-i concentrăm esența într-o definiție? Ei, acel ceva nu este o entitate, ci o metodă, care la rândul ei este expresia celei mai nobile însușiri omenești, năzuința de a cunoaște adevărul. Thank you very much. But finally, I would like to thank the Biological Science section of the Romanian Academy and to all colleagues for their support, especially to academician Maia Simionescu, and also to my colleagues from Fundația Emil G. Racoviță. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. The next section, it's mostly dedicated to the Belgica's legacies. And for that, we will have a moderator to introduce the speakers. And the moderator, it's Oana Marcu. She's a co-founder of the Emil G. Racoviță Foundation and one of the scientist's great-granddaughter. She graduated from Babeș-Bolyai University and holds a PhD from the University of Western Ontario in Canada. And after doing research and teaching development biology at the University of California, Irvine and Fullerton, she moved to NASA, where she was payload scientist for an immunity experiment on the Discovery Shuttle, the lead scientist for a NASA initiative to build the world's first open science repository of all biological data and metadata from the International Space Station, and was part of the team for the first PCR facility in the microgravity of the International Space Station. So, Oana, you have the microphone.
Thank you, Bogdan. It's a pleasure to see and meet everybody today. And from my NASA experience, if there's anything I learned from sending missions and sending science in the unknown and probing the unknown, is that science is very rarely a one-person deal. It is much rather the concerted effort of a big team. And so this was the guiding idea behind organizing this Belgica section of the symposium. Even though we honor Emil Racoviță today, I'm sure he would have been couldn't have been happier, and nothing would have bring him more joy than to credit and acknowledge all the men of the crew who enabled him to go to Antarctica, who basically saved his life and brought back the material he collected. And more because he was a man who thought about the future, to acknowledge the people who came after him and to continue the work these days. So thank you to all of you who accepted the invitation. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor De Decker, Patrick De Decker. Do we have the slide, please? So Professor De Decker works at the Australian University. He is Belgian by birth, by Australian by naturalization, and he is one of Australia's most considered earth scientist. He was the head of the former Department of Geology, and he's still contributing to Australian and international earth science in the multidisciplinary fields of micropaleontology and the chemical composition of microfossils, in limnology, aeolian dust and airborne deposits, and in paleoceanography, which basically means he's looking for life in the past and in the present, in all environments, terrestrial, water, and the wind. And his aim is a very big one, to obtain information that allows us to understand the global and regional climatic variability from the reconstruction of past marine and continental environments. He is the recipient of many medals. He was elected to the Australian Academy of Sciences in 2012. And little unknown fact, he actually shares a birthday with Emil Racoviță, so happy birthday week to Professor de Decker. And in 2018, he published a paper called On the Long Ignored Scientific Achievements of the Belgica Expedition, which was the incentive for us to invite, and we're very pleased that he accepted our invitation to talk to us today.
Hello everyone, it's Patrick de Decker in Canberra in Australia, and I would like to talk to you about the extraordinary achievements by the biologist Emil Racoviță during and after the Belgica expedition that started in 1897 and was completed in 1899. You have here a photograph in full color of the Belgica ship trapped in sea ice, and members of the crew bringing ice back to the ship in order to melt that water, that ice for drinking water, but also to stop any potential fires on the ship. You have here two photographs of the ship in Antwerp, in the harbour of Antwerp. You see the belfry on the right-hand side in the background that still exists today. You have also a photograph of the ship trapped in sea ice, and the dimensions of the ship, basically 34 meters long, and you could actually lift the propeller so it wouldn't be smashed into the sea ice. The members of the Belgica expedition were quite amazing. It was a truly international expedition funded by the Belgian government and Belgians. And in total, there were 9 Belgians, 6 Norwegians, 2 Polish, 1 Romanian, Emil Racoviță, who was 29, and 1 American, the doctor, Frederick Cook. You can see here that it was a very young crew overall, and Racoviță was one of the eldest. And because he spoke French, it was easy for him to communicate with some others. The American doctor said that he didn't speak French, and he said, I have to converse in Latin, but they obviously learned French through time. Emil Racoviță, and I think you've got quite a lot of information about him already, and he obtained a law degree from the University of Paris, and then he turned to natural sciences, his great interest. And his mentor was Henry de la Clase-Duthiers at La Sorbonne, who recommended him to participate on the Belgica cruise. He published his thesis, which was rare at the time, on polychaete worms. And you know that there is an Antarctic station named after him, but it's a double name. The other name, Philip Lowe, was an Australian explorer who has had a lot to do with Romania since. And you need to know that, in fact, the new Australian Antarctic ship was built in Romania. Concerning the expedition, Racoviță was asked to select camera and photographic equipment for the expedition. He also purchased a lot of material, and you've got here at least fishing gear and so on, guns and clothing. But he was primarily a pioneer in ethology, the science of animal behavior. And during the expedition, he methodically studied the behavior of seals, whales, and birds, including penguins. He was the first one to study the embryology of seals and the first one to photograph whales. And his knowledge of biology was simply outstanding. He gathered more than 1,200 zoological samples and 481 botanic samples. You can see here a list, and I'm not going to go through in great detail, but 1 year before the expedition, he was already doing quite a lot of work of preparation. He went to Kiel in Germany to examine plankton nets, to Monaco to examine the yacht there, but that was a biological station. He went to Naples in Italy to study how to preserve animals and perform dredgings. He visited two of the Belgian professors of zoology who helped him prepare the expedition. And he went to the famous Haeckel in Leipzig to discuss about plankton collections and tools. And he went to the Zeiss factory to prepare some photographic material. And he even went to Paris to buy quite a lot of material. And they were considering purchasing a hot air balloon, but decided to abandon that idea because it was just too hard to transport a lot of acid and iron. And he also was designated originally as the photographer of the expedition, but a medical doctor, Frederick Cook, took on that role after joining the ship. Here's a map of the southern part of South America, showing you in brown the trip that the ship did around the Antarctic Peninsula. And you can see that they went through the Antarctic Peninsula here and discovered quite a lot of a passage and new islands, and then they got trapped in the sea ice for 13 months. And you can see that the ship drifted around with the sea ice, and 13 months later, they were freed, and they returned to Punta Arenas. They also spent quite a lot of time investigating the biology and the botany of the Beagle Channel. The results of the Belgica expedition are extraordinary. Here's a list of these publications, some of these publications that I found in the library of the University of Sydney. And it's 70 centimeters tall, and it contains a large pile of material that was published as a result of material gathered and collected during the expedition. There must be a copy of it somewhere in Romania. The scientific achievements by members of the expedition and co-workers amounts to 980 pages. And you can see here the list of all the topics dealing with physics, meteorology, oceanography, and geology. It's very impressive. But then, even more so, when you look at the fauna and flora descriptions based on material that Emil Racoviță collected, 2,124 pages, plus publication by Racoviță himself, and that totals 2,787 pages. Extraordinary. On the fauna, there was 1,470 pages, and on the flora, quite a bit also. And Racoviță published quite a monograph on whales, and another monograph was published posthumously by Professor Dumitru Murariu who worked at the museum before he retired. And you'll see some of these in more details. So a total of 348 new species and 25 genera were described in the Resultat. And here's a list of species and genera that bear the name of Racoviță, which is quite a tradition done by various authors, and others done by other members of the expedition. But you can see that once again, Racoviță received the most ample credit. So these are the list of the pages that were published, and then there have been 400 scientific reports and publications published since, and many of them are available in the Belgian Flanders Marine Institute in Ostend called VLIS, and you can find these reports, and also in France at Ifremer. In comparison, the English had done an expedition about the same time, and they only published one book with 344 pages. There are reasons for that, but the Belgica expedition and the work of Racoviță was outstanding. And Emil Racoviță spent a lot of time studying whales, and there was you've got a list here of the observations that he made, and they were all very new to science. And he made a lot of observations on that. And here are some drawings that he made of the behavior of various whales in Antarctic waters, and also how they reach the surface of the ocean and re-enter. And also, he published the first ever photographs of whales. And those of you who've tried to photograph whales with an electronic camera, it's easier today, but there they only had one shot. And you can see part of the mountains in the background that belong to the subantarctic peninsula. So Racoviță participated in the landing here, they observed the whales, but also went on some of the mountains and collected a lot of animals and plants. And you'll hear from someone that he was the first one to discover a midge fly. And the Americans have published a summary in English, a book that's very hard to find. And if anybody wants a copy, they can contact me. But because all the publications of Racoviță were in French. So luckily, Dumitru Murariu published in 2016 a volume of 520 pages based on the notes that Racoviță had made. And but he never got to publish them. But there's a lot of new information. There's even a little interesting anecdote that he tasted the milk of a seal milk, and he said it was awful taste of cold liver oil. And in the Antipa Museum, I found some photographs that he had taken of seals. He had also done a lot of magnificent drawings, and you can recognize his handwriting there on the bottom left-hand corner, and again, some of these magnificent drawings. He also scraped the flesh, and in the Brussels Museum, you can find skeleton of seals and the phalanges of the seal. And here's a photograph of him collecting a penguin, and with his very common alpine beret that he used to wear. And another photograph that he took of these penguins, again with him, and I've seen sketches based on that photographs as well. So he collected some penguins that are now stuffed and kept in the museum in Brussels. So I'm going to quickly show you some examples of specimens collected by Racoviță. And I'll say straight away, this man had an amazing knowledge of biology and botany, because in his notebooks, he described all these organisms. Here's a photo of the Belgica in the ice, and a penguin looking over. They were digging holes in the ice, and they had devised a special system so they could actually take water samples, plankton samples, rock samples on the seafloor, and it was a real team effort, as you can see. And here's a classic photo of Racoviță in his laboratory on the ship with one of the Zeiss microscope that he purchased in Germany. Before reaching the subantarctic peninsula, they went through the Beagle Channel, where Darwin had been. And just look at this photograph of the ship. Someone must have climbed the mountains to take a photograph of the ship. But during that time, Racoviță was collecting insects and plants and so on. And I'm going to show you some examples of the publications, the drawings made by experts who received the material from Racoviță once he was in Belgium after the expedition. Here's some amazing drawings, beautifully illustrated and by Belgian and European experts. And here's some others, some beetles that were collected in the Beagle Channel, and some chironomid midges, again, very detailed, and they're all in these monographs that I talked about before, most of them published in French. He also collected some very small jellyfish, about 0.5 centimeter in diameter, and here's a photograph of a live one collected near Racoviță Island by a German colleague, and you can see that he must have devised some really good preserving technique to enable the experts, Mars here, to draw them. He also looked at nematodes. That was the field of his PhD. And when you go to the museum in Brussels, the Natural History Museum, you can see some of the material, like a large crustacean, collected during the Belgica, and a fish as well. And there was a lot of interest in deep sea fish. They thought they were going to be the same as in the Northern Hemisphere, all new. And the fish expert described this new genus after Emil Racoviță. He also collected a lot of mites in the nostrils of seals and so on. So he knew where to find these, but if you see these magnificent drawings, you know that his preservation techniques would have been good. He also collected a lot of herbaria described by people, and some fungi, and he was the first one to describe a flower in the only flowering plant in Antarctica. He also collected deep sea corals, which are now extremely important because they were collected 120 years ago, and the geologists can do the chemistry of the corals and this is probably a 300-year specimen that you could tell past sea surface temperatures or bottom temperatures. There's a nice photograph of Racoviță in his lab. You can see his microscope there behind, and probably repairing a plankton net. Before going to Antarctica, they also went to, as I said, the Beagle Channel here, but they also visited Dawson Island near Punta Arenas, and they went to see Indian colonies. And there were 3 members of the expedition, the Polish Racoviță, the Frederick Cook, and Racoviță. And they were amazed at the poor condition of the Indians, and they said they soon will be exterminated. Racoviță said they were suffering from tuberculosis, syphilis, and even children. And they reported that farmers were paying £1 to kill some Indians. And Racoviță also created a little dictionary of French to honor Indian language, but mostly dealing with animals. Other people like Rakovsky had another vocabulary. Here's a photograph taken by Frederick Cook of these Indians in the Beagle Channel, and sadly, that race is now extinct. And then Racoviță had a really good sense of humor. And when he was during the lockdown on the ship, he had some sarcastic drawings. Here's one of them, another one with a French word there, and all the text was written in French. There's the translation here in English. And so he had time to make his friends a bit more relaxed. And they had a cat on the ship that died during the periods of scurvy, and the rats appeared, and you can see that's the typical handwriting of Racoviță. And the final drawing of Rakovsky talking to the penguins. So in summary, Racoviță was an outstanding biologist who extensively collected biological specimens, and it contributed, I'm adamant about that, to the great success of the Belgian expedition. He had a very pleasant personality during the lockdown in the ice. There were quite a lot of conflict between people, and Racoviță was never part of that. So, and it is also important to note that after the expedition ended, he spent a huge amount of time curating the specimen and sending them to the experts. So I end my talk now. Thank you very much.
Voilà, ai microfonul închis.
Thank you, Professor Decker. This was an outstanding presentation. If there are any questions from the audience, we can take them in chat or directly, since it's a small group of people. Professor Decker is in person here. It's 1 a.m. in Australia.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I know so much about that period of Racoviță, and I could have given a 2-hour talk. Anyway, I'll stop talking here.
Actually, we do need to prepare for a 2-hour talk. It stuns me how much information you have collected.
Yeah, I'll come back to Cluj at some stage. Yeah.
You need to come back to Cluj. So it makes me wonder if you have the same amount of information about the rest of the crew from Belgica. And I know you're planning to write a book. Could you talk a little bit about what it took you to accumulate?
On the scientific aspect of the Belgica. Yeah.
And how long did it take you to collect all this information?
Well, I went to Norway. I went to Poland. As I also went to Belgium and England and Romania, of course. I only spent one day in Romania. But there's a lot of people interested in rediscovering some of the achievement of Racoviță. And there's lots of archives in Cluj, but also in Bucharest that need to be looked at.
Yes, definitely. That is one of our goals, to look in more detail. So we'll be very pleased to host you back again in Cluj. Yeah. Anybody else has questions for Professor Decker? I can't see them in chat.
And one last comment. His French was better than mine. He had an eloquent way of writing in French, and all his field notes, that are some of them that are found in the Antipa Museum, are all in French. So, and also he had a great support of his family. His parents went to live with him in France, and when they returned from the expedition, his father wrote to the leader of the expedition and said, "Please do not take my son again." I think the family was very, very close, and he was the only son, as far as I know. Anyway, I think I might leave you because it's 1 o'clock in the morning, and I've got other duties to do tomorrow. Thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll keep in touch. And we are going to move next to Anders Bache from the Roald Amundsen House. Originally, Anders was an archaeologist with a focus on historical sites in the polar region. But in the recent years, Anders has led the research and digitization of the Roald Amundsen House, which we invite you to watch online. There will be a link to it. And this digitization have included a full digital version of the house and entire collection, as well as several podcasts, books, lectures, and articles. So if we could go to Anders' presentation. It's an exciting event that they have done.
My name is Anders Bakke, and I'm one of those lucky people that works here in Roald Amundsen's house, Uranienborg, located at Svartskog, south of Oslo, the capital in Norway. And this is a perfect spot for Roald Amundsen. He lived here for 20 years. This was a place where he could hide away as the world celebrity he was. And the house here is still standing as he left it when he disappeared in the summer 1928. Which makes this a perfect place to study the man, the myth, and the legend. Let's go inside. Here in Amundsen's house, we do have a biographical perspective on his life. We are trying to understand more about his life and the man and the expeditions through the objects and things he left behind. And Amundsen, he lived in time where the whole world developed. Even polar exploration changed quite much. He started his first expeditions with big sailing ships that froze into the ice, and he kind of ended his life in aircraft that fly across the ice in a few days. Crucial element for the research we are doing here in Amundsen's house is that all of those things here is a part of Amundsen's collection. They must be here for a reason, right? Or in other words, all of those things here must have had a great value for Roald Amundsen. Blue Room is a very symbolic little object related to the Belgica expedition. This tablecloth here is made by Frederick Albert Cook, and is, as far as I know, the only one of its kind. It was given to Roald Amundsen in January 1926 when he was touring around in America, and he traveled through Kansas City when he was informed that his friend Frederick Cook was sitting in Leavenworth prison for his third year. And Amundsen decided to visit his old friend, and in jail, Frederick Cook has made this tablecloth for Amundsen, which Amundsen brought back home. With his own words, Amundsen explained the moment in his last book, My Life as an Explorer, when he says, "I felt I could do no less than to make the short journey to the prison and call upon my former benefactor in his present misfortune." Amundsen's study. This is where he worked, this is where he planned his expeditions, this is where he did his home workouts, and this is also the room which is filled with mementos and remains from the Belgica expedition. There's all those books standing here. Several of the books are from the crew and the men on board the Belgica. We have books from Frederick Cook, Dubrovsky, Galart. But another thing is this fantastic old map of the Antarctic from 1895. It is obviously well used, and some sources says that this was on board the Belgica on the way down to the Antarctic. I still don't know for sure. Another fantastic object is this penguin from the Belgica expedition. Amundsen got it back home. We don't know how or from who, but we know that the penguins was a crucial factor for survival for the Belgica crew. They were also used for different purposes.
Another penguin-related object from the Amundsen collection can be found here, in the museum magazine. Here we have a medal Amundsen received on the 30th of July, 1898. Just before himself, Lecointe and Cook began what Amundsen described as the first sledge expedition on the Antarctic sea ice. The goal was to find penguins and, not at least, experience something other than life on board. One example is this fabulous photograph shot by Amundsen. In January 1899, Amundsen and Cook attempted a new experiment, tying a rope around the legs of one of the captured king penguins and placing it in front of a sledge. The hope is that it will act as a draft animal. It managed a few meters, but no further. Draft penguins will never be a success. We know Amundsen kept in contact with several of the Belgica crew after the expedition for many years. In the archive from Roald Amundsen's house, which is now primarily stored at the fabulous National Library in Norway, you may also find the sketchbook from Racoviță, which he must have given to Amundsen. And it gives us a unique glimpse of the life and the humor on board and on the ice.
Recent years. One of them is this red album here, given to Amundsen from Lecointe in October 1900. And in here we have photos from the whole expedition, both the journey down south, the life in the ice, and also on board the ship. Another fantastic album is this portrait album with photos of several of the members of the expedition, which we also know that exists several other places. But the very unique is this book of drawings, collection of Johan Holten's drawings from the expeditions. And here we see animals, we have the ship, and also the landscape they sailed in and around it. From the collection here, it is clearly that the Belgica expedition and the crew on board meant a lot for Roald Amundsen, both as an explorer but also for his private life. And we have now, the last couple of years, been digging into the collection here and we're putting more and more of the information and knowledge out on our website, so it will be available for everyone around the world. Thank you for your attention. If you ever are in Norway, you're more than welcome to Roald Amundsen's house.
Thank you very much to Anders and the entire Roald Amundsen house. And I think this presentation exemplifies absolutely the best, amazing friendships that can develop in terms of when men are in survival mode. Everybody on board becomes actually your family. So these friendships last for a long time. And we know that was the case of Racoviță and all his friends as well. And there would be no better transition from Roald Amundsen to his best friend, Frederick Cook. And it's our pleasure that Carol Smith, who is the executive director of the Frederick Cook Society in New York, accepted our invitation to speak today on their view of Frederick Cook. The origins of the Frederick Cook Society date back to 1940. And to Dr. Cook's friend and fellow explorer, Ralph Scheinenwald von Achterfeld. The original purpose of the society was to defend Dr. Cook's claim to the North Pole. However, the current mission is to promote Dr. Cook's life work as explorer, ethnographer, writer, physician, and photographer. So please join me in welcoming Carol Smith, who will be talking to us about many aspects of Dr. Cook's personality.
Okay, thank you. Oana, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, well, thank you, and greetings from New York. It's quite an honor to be here. The Cook Society has newly been reformed, and our mission, as you just heard, is really to champion his life's work. And of everything he accomplished, I think one of the most fascinating things was the way he studied human nature and the mind. He had experience in isolation. He spent many years at Leavenworth Prison. And I think, I don't want to talk too much. We put together a brief video, but Dr. Cook's life was really a creative and artistic expression of who he was. And he studied what is said to be the greatest and most impenetrable of all the fields of science, which is the study of the mind. He was compassionate. He was insightful. He was curious, a lifelong student of all of the big questions. And with that, we simply put together a collection of his photography with a couple brief videos to give you an introduction into his work, his creativity, his spirit, and his contribution. So I don't want to say more than that. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Carol.
I will share now the video that you prepared.
Thanks.
Go.
My name is Carol Smith. I'm the director of the Frederick Cook Society. We are located in Sullivan County, New York, in the Sullivan County Museum. This is Dr. Cook's birthplace. And I'd really like to thank the Racoviță Foundation for bringing us together in this conference. It's just a wonderful idea. The title of my talk is Frederick Cook Reimagined. And I believe that history has kind of labeled Dr. Cook as the man that got to the pole, or maybe didn't get to the pole, but what we've learned and what we've kind of uncovered in the last few years is that his life was really so much more than that. And we'd like to talk about his role as scientist, humanitarian, ethnologist, writer, and so in 1985, the Frederick Cook Society moved into the Sullivan County Museum in Hurleyville and installed this beautiful permanent gallery. The gallery is filled with photographs and information and artifacts from all of Cook's major expeditions, but the piece that we're most proud of and which is most extraordinary is above my head, and this is the actual flag from the Belgica. It was presented to Cook in gratitude for his work saving the lives of the men
Nu știu, mătura pentru că te sprijină în ea.
Thank you, Carol. And if there was one thing that you would like to take on next with the Cook Foundation, what is it? There's so much to the life of this man. What is one aspect that the society, the Cook Society, is going to focus on from now on?
Well, we started by really bringing forth a group of his photography, and that work amazingly has never been exhibited as fine art. We put together a collection of 50 of his photographs in our museum, and it's just been extraordinary to see his work all together. He was so creative, and he was such a great artist. That's what drew me into his work and into this world of exploration. My background is art. So we're exploring Dr. Cook's life as an artist, as a creative person, as a humanitarian, as an environmentalist. And all of these aspects of his personality are really important to bring forth to the world. They're as relevant today as they were back then. So we're just starting. This is a new incarnation of the Cook Society, the third, as I've been told. And it's made up of a lot of artists and creative people. And we're exploring creativity and compassion and the role that those two particular aspects of his personality have in the Belgica, in saving the lives of the men and of his entire life. So that's where we're beginning. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Carol. And we're sure to follow on your footsteps, because we're also at the beginning with the foundation, but highlighting these bonds and the very large personalities of these men is really important.
Yes,
And
I look forward to that.
thank you. Thank you very much for joining us from New York.
Thank you so much.
And now we're going to move on to another big personality, and actually his family. And this was Captain Lecointe, the captain of the Belgica expedition. We have the pleasure of Charlotte Rollin Jacquemin, who is the great-granddaughter of Georges Lecointe. And she and her husband, Olivier de Schrevel, who is now online, They live in Belgium, and it turns out they are absolutely outstanding experts in the history and the detail of the Belgica expedition. They have absolutely graciously accepted our invitation to join us today. So if we could spotlight them and play the video that they have prepared ahead of time that has a tremendous amount of information. Welcome, Olivier. It's a pleasure to see you here.
Charlotte and I will present some highlights of Racoviță before, during, and after the Belgica expedition. Key period. It took more than 3 years to prepare and fund this expedition. Raco was involved during the last year. The Belgica ship left Antwerp and arrived 2 months later in Rio de Janeiro. During 2 months, they made 24 landings in the Strait of Magellan and the Beagle Channel. Actually, it was not planned to visit the Tierra del Fuego. Then 20 days of impressive discovery in the Antarctic Peninsula. They had thawed at the end of the summer and the ship was trapped in the ice pack. They spent 10 months overwintering on this ice pack, and some made a risky exploration on the ice pack. It was a fantastic escape team effort which lasted for 3 months. Where they could be free of the ice and reach back to South America. The scientific made conference on this achievement and results when they arrived back in Belgium in November 1999. The Belgica Commission started the scientific publication. Most were published in the first 12 years, but it took a long time to follow up the research who make the scientific publication, and Racoviță got the main work on that. Then there was an interesting initiative to set up a Polar Research Association, and they hold Congress in the early 90s. Actually, Racoviță left the Belgica expedition in Rio de Janeiro, and it was agreed that he will join back the expedition in Punta Arenas. So he got a fast steamboat, and he met Dr. Moreno during this trip, and Moreno was from Argentina, and he wants to do an exploration of the border between Chile and Argentina. So they made an expedition 300 kilometers north of Punta Arenas. And for instance, Raco visit a cave which with remain of a large or extinct airy beast called Bilondo. They changed their plan and they decide to, instead of going directly to Antarctic, to go through the different channel of the Tierra del Fuego, and it took 2 months. And actually, the ship nearly sank on a rock at the end of this sailing. The scientific were very excited to make interesting finding, like Charles Darwin made several years before. And they were all impressed by the Fujian Indian, and in particular by a dictionary wrote by the English Bridges, who tried to translate Yangan sound in English word. They decided to make a publication of this dictionary, but it was an unbelievable, epic, and eventful publication from the return, and it was published, edited only in 23, actually to Australian linguists, Austrian, and with the previous intervention of anthropologists and linguists with the difficult grammar, printing, and transcription. Took splendid photos, and actually it was Racoviță who select the equipment. He visit manufacturers and ordered equipment from French and German suppliers. During the 20 days discovering the Antarctica Peninsula, at one stage they split in two teams. 5 were make some survey on an island, actually a mountain. They got actually difficult weather, and they could achieve little scientific and surveys. And in the same times, the Belgica ship under the commandment of the Point discovered further the strait, saw an opening to the southwest, and they made 2 landings where Racoviță made remarkable discovery that we will discuss afterwards. And then in green line, the ship sailed back to pick up the 5 people left on this island. Racoviță discovered the unique insect living in Antarctica. It's called today the Belgica Antarctica. It's a species of flightless midge endemic to the continent. It's 2 to 6 millimeters long. It is the largest purely terrestrial animal native to the continent, as well as its own insect. Actually, they discovered already larvae on previous landing. For example, on the Cape Van Beneden was a scientific support Racoviță for the selection of Racoviță in the expedition. Racoviță also discovered the first flowering plants. He took risk because he climbed this cliff to collect the plants, which is called now the Antarctic air grass. He was actually attacked by a bird because Raco was going very close to a nest. There are only 2 flowering. Most different ones. Racoviță also, during the overwintering, wants to collect fish under the ice pack, and it was a cooperative work between the zoologists, the geologist, oceanograph Toski, the Amundsen. Actually, these are the drawing from the Amundsen diary, and the Belgian engineer to adapt the fishing equipment to this condition. Each scientific had an assistant. For Raco, it was the sailor Johan Corren, which is here. It's opening a penguin. Here you see Racoviță, who is studying the social life of a penguin community, also during the exploration of the Belgica Strait with the Quiet when the other were on the island Brabant. Koren was so impressed by Racoviță that he decided to become himself a field biologist and became a polar pioneer. During the overwintering, they make plans for future exploration and actually also to achieve the main goal of the Belgica expedition, which was to reach the South Magnetic Pole. And the officer made long letters to detail this plan and meetings, and they decide to sign each staff meeting to commit all on this agreed objective. Here is the signature of Emil Racoviță, the Frederick book here, one Amundsen. And actually, all these quite interesting letters written on board have never been published until now in Belgium, and the first who published was Julian Sancton recently. A last fact, just after the return, was the setup of this international polar research. You see, explorator and here Racoviță will sign this protocol of this research, which is the main objective was to make scientific cooperation in Antarctica. It's obviously it's what's the Antarctic Treaty today, and Racoviță co-signed with this explorer. Amundsen actually was busy at that time with the Northwest Passage exploration. Racoviță himself became later organizer of French and Romanian scientific institution. We thank you and participate if necessary at this further discussion.
Yes, thank you so much, Olivier and Charlotte. And of course, we're just so delighted to have you here in person as well. And one of the questions that came in the discussions with the Cook Society and also with the Amundsen House was all the letters that they exchanged after the trip, and to witness the friendship that they had over so many years. So one of my personal question is, are there any letters that you have from Racoviță in your collection from Captain Lecointe or from Cook or Amundsen?
Yes, there are a lot of letters. Lecointe was the secretary of the Belgica Commission, the Scientific Commission. So he wrote around 700 letters. And there are letters even with Frederick Cook on the Yagan dictionary. And there are around 50 letters on this story of the Yagan dictionary. Also with Racoviță in the early stage, he was involved. There are also letters at the end, after the death of Lecointe. The Gerlach was not published any paper for the scientific commission. After he was retired for actually one year before he died, he started to communicate again with Racoviță to fulfill a rewriting on some periods of the expedition. There are also letters, obviously, with Amundsen and his brother. There are even some amazing letters sometimes for some visit he made. So they continue to have a lot of estimate for each other. I remember one letter of Racoviță to Amundsen where he said when Amundsen reached the South Pole, he wrote, I knew you from during the Belgica expedition, and I felt you was becoming a great explorer. So, and he make another amazing comment. Amundsen asked Racoviță, can you come in Norway? And he say that I don't remember exactly the sentence, but the dollar is the distance between Oslo and Romania is as high the cost of the travel. So he could not make it the travel. And I know also that Lecointe met Racoviță in Paris to discuss on the scientific paper. So there are numerous letters indeed afterwards.
Thank you so much. And it's really so clear that you're literally a walking encyclopedia of all the data and all the history of Belgica. Do you plan to write this down and bring it to light? There's so much detailed information that I feel it's being missed in between one place working here, one place working here, but it feels like you have it all together. And I know that because Georges Lecointe was part of the Belgica Commission, he actually was incredibly important in publishing and making available all the material.
Well, the first intention was to cross the information, because sometimes the real story, the facts are changed during the time, or some people want to rewrite the story. So we had the chance that during the expedition, I think 9 people wrote paper, sailors left paper, and so I tried to set up a database every day. For example, the 23 December, what tell Raco, what say Amundsen, what say Cook, what say Lecointe, what say the Gerlache, what say the sailor. So at the end, you have you can say, okay, that's what happened. And so the purpose was to consolidate all the information, and there was language problems. For example, the early diary of Dobrowski, who was a young student, Polish student, wrote in Polish. Artowski wrote in German. So there are different languages, and it's important to collect all the information. Now, for writing myself a book, we are still in professional life, and I put a little aside these topics, but I have some idea. For example, if you organize another event, I think just on base of the cartoon of Racoviță, people don't know always what's the story behind the sketch, and we can make a presentation just on all the cartoons to explain a bit what happened on the Belgica expedition.
Thank you so much, Olivier and Charlotte. Then we know our next step to organize another symposium and tease out the real stories behind all the drawings and all their happenings on Belgica. Thank you so much again for joining us. And you made a beautiful introduction actually already to Julian Sancton, who is the author of this book that was published. Let me see if it shows in here. Oh, there we go. The book was published first in 2021, Madhouse at the End of the Earth. Welcome, Julian, from New York.
Thanks very much for having me. It's an honor, and thanks to the Racoviță Foundation.
You did such a great service to the Belgica expedition. It's sort of been in the unknown. It's not even listed on many sites, as many people do not know actually about the expedition, the fact that it was the first scientific expedition to the Antarctic. So the first question for you would be, what was your incentive not as a scientist, but you brought it to the real public, to the wide public. What was your incentive to start writing this book?
Yeah, I'm certainly not a scientist, and in fact, that's why I feel so honored to be in such illustrious company today among real scientists, real experts. I was a journalist, and I've written on a lot of different topics about culture, about business. But I was a history student in university, and so I've always had a keen interest in that. And I read an article in the New Yorker magazine, a fantastic general interest magazine, about NASA's plans for preparing people for the pressures of long extended space missions, particularly to Mars. And this article began in a rather unexpected fashion with a summary of the Belgica expedition, which has been studied by, among other people, an anthropologist named Jack Stuster, who made a lot of recommendations for NASA based on the early polar explorations, because lest we forget, the Antarctic and the Arctic, but particularly the Antarctic at that time, was the closest thing to what Mars is to us today. It was a foreign, distant, hostile, barren, inhospitable environment. And so the very heroic men, because at that time it was all men, who were the first to brave these extreme environments, learned a lot of lessons the hard way, and made a lot of mistakes, but also made a lot of very ingenious adaptations that have been very instructive for future Antarctic personnel, but also, according to this article, for future human explorers to outer space. And so I was fascinated by that. I was particularly fascinated by the 3-paragraph summary of this expedition, which I had never heard about. I'd heard of Shackleton, I'd heard of Robert Falcon Scott, I'd obviously heard of Amundsen. And so when his name popped up there, I said, Amundsen, well, this is an early expedition by Amundsen, and who is this Frederick Cook character that he seems so outlandish and so fascinating? And then the idea that of all places it came from Belgium, which I had not known to have a great seafaring tradition. And my great grandfather's Belgian, and so that also ticked a box. And I learned that Frederick Cook lives just down the road down there, or rather he did, for the last few months of his life. And so I decided to read about the Belgica expedition, and found that I couldn't find any books, at least in English. There are a couple very interesting books by a man named Joseph Verlinden, who's Belgian, who writes in Dutch. And so I didn't know that they were fascinating until I met him, because I couldn't read them. So I have since had many discussions with Joseph, and also with present company, Olivier de Screvel and Charlotte Rollin, and many other people who were involved, or who were descended from, or who had knowledge of the Belgica expedition. And so over the course of a year, or rather 2 years of research, I was able to form a narrative. I'm not an expert. I'm a narrative nonfiction writer, and so I wrote a narrative version of this expedition.
In fact, I think this is one of the best things, that you did write a narrative, but also so incredibly well documented. It's so impressive that you're able to spin this story that reads so well and easily, and it's so accessible to the public, and yet it's super well documented. Could you walk a little bit through some key moments of your trail of trying to find what this expedition was about, especially that you mentioned one time, it's like, well, what is the sensorial experience of this? So clearly you wanted to get into it. Can you mention some?
Absolutely. Yeah, there were several phases. And once again, I must thank Olivier and Charlotte for alerting me to those letters that he mentioned, which was a crucial element of this expedition. The letters sent on board. It's remarkable how well, how much of their discussions were kept on paper, partly because people wanted to keep a paper trail of disagreements, partly because they wanted to report back to Belgium, and to the Royal Belgian Geographic Society about all, but also because people were in their cabins. De Gerlache was not always very accessible, and so there was a long written record. So and as Olivier points out, that 9 or so members of the expedition came back with some kind of written firsthand primary source account, whether it's diaries or logs or drawings. Corin was also a very gifted artist, and then we have the memoirs. So I assembled all of those and traveled to Brussels to the the Museum of Natural Sciences there, which kept the archives of the Belgica, and that was also a very useful trove with all the preparations and all the documents related to the assembly of the crew, and the correspondence. And that's where I learned how well Racoviță spoke French, and also where I started to, as I've mentioned to you, Anna, Racoviță was probably the member of the expedition I would most like to have met and had a beer with. You know, he was both a brilliant man, obviously, but also a really humorous man. And in the course of my research, I, as a former cartoonist myself, I also I took particular pleasure in his cartoons, but I also, even in his scientific writings, you see a spark of his personality and of his sense of humor, and they're always just so riveting. They're not dry at all. As academically sound and professional as they are they're really fascinating. And so but I digress. He also had a very mischievous sense of humor, and I want to talk about the pranks that he pulled on Arctovsky, but again, let's talk about that later. And then as you say, I wanted to get that sensory experience, and Frederick Cook and Lecointe and Racoviță took many wonderful pictures, photographs of the Antarctic, but there's only so much that I could glean from those. And given that the Antarctic, and particularly the Gerlache Strait, was such a important part of this expedition, such a crucial setting for this book, I needed to go there myself. I decided to be able to describe this environment in a sort of in a way that would appeal to the five senses. You know, the smells, the sounds, the textures, and even the colors. The photographs are beautiful, and in many ways the Antarctic has not changed all that much, at least outwardly, from those photos. And on overcast days they do seem black and white, but when the sun shines, you can see this range of colors that is just mind-boggling. And so that I'm very glad that I was able to go there to relate that, because for the men there, you know, they were experiencing it very much as I experienced it, except I did it under much more luxurious circumstances aboard a cruise where I could just sit back and have a martini, and they were, you know, the first to explore this treacherous land. So I'm not comparing myself to them in any way. And I had no desire to get locked in the ice for a winter to see what that was like.
Yeah, that's true. Even though the experience was different, you mentioned actually something that the Antarctic hasn't changed, but it is said that the Antarctica changes people who go there, even if it is for a short amount of time. Yeah. So I'm curious how writing this book and traveling to Antarctica, but really being immersed and talking to Olivier and going and finding all this data, how did that change you? And did it?
It did, in the sense that it taught me about the endurance and the amazing feats of which mankind is capable. I had some sense of that, but not really as visceral a sense as I do now. It also taught me that I'm not one of those people. So I'm very you know, there's, and several of the people on board the Belgica turned out to not be as particularly well suited to that kind of exploration, although they were far braver than I to even have gone on the ship. But you know, the men like men like the people who drafted the plan to go to the South Magnetic Pole, like Cook and Amundsen and LeCointe, were clearly, they suffered, but they were very ultimately they recovered and they were very well adapted. Racoviță also suffered. Arctoschi suffered as well, and but they were scientists more so than they were people who wanted to reach. Oh, excuse me for this. They didn't just want to reach the ends of the earth for its own sake. They wanted to study it, and so those were two different motivations that in some cases existed in the same people. But that was to answer your question. How did it change me? Well, for one thing, it taught me how difficult it is to write a book. But in terms of traveling to Antarctica was definitely something that changed my conception of the size of the Earth and of the fragility of the Earth. And you mentioned, repeating what I said, that it doesn't look like it changed much, but traveling there, you realize exactly how much it has changed, because I've traveled with some scientists who were taking regular observations of the very same waters in which the Belgica sailed, and were noticing very alarming things, such as the reduced salinity of the water around there from the increased glacier melt, and that is leading to a transformation of the population, or rather a migration of the organisms that live in those waters. And with the migration of the phytoplankton, migration might not be the right word. Again, I'm not a scientist, but with the movement of the phytoplankton, the krill has to follow that, and then further south in colder, saltier waters. And then everything that depends, the entire ecosystem that depends on the krill then needs to migrate further south. And this is just one of the many things that is at first gradually and soon very quickly changing, and to an alarming degree. So it just the writing this book and traveling to Antarctica and seeing how this environment is changing it just alerted me even more so than I had already been to the dangers of climate change.
Yes, thank you, Julian. This is so brilliantly put that you're actually seeing the timestamp. In fact, Belgica can act as a timestamp. This is how it was. They took so many meteorological and so much data from 125 years ago, and 120 years later, we can actually use the data to compare what's happening today, right? So that's brilliant.
Exactly. And I would be very curious to have a real scientist actually rigorously compare this data, and I'm sure people have, but the publication of that would be fascinating to me. And I'm also very curious to see to see Olivier's database. I think that'd be an invaluable resource.
Yes, and I have one last question, but I'm encouraging the audience to also post questions or raise hands or post questions in the chat. One question that I have that I'm curious about is, I have personally noticed so many varied reviews about your book. This book has been so loved, and so I know I passed it on to many people. So well read. Amazon reviews are incredible, and some range from understanding that it took leadership and compassion and professionalism for Belgica to survive, and other titles say it's a failed attempt to explore Antarctica. And we're trying to demonstrate right here, this is by no means a failed attempt to explore. We're still using the data, and like you said, we have the timestamp. So how do you feel? Do you feel like with your book you reached the audience in the way you wanted? What was your personal message?
I also took issue with people saying it was a failed mission, because it certainly wasn't. It came back with thousands of pages and hundreds of species, and it took 40 years for people to parse through all the data that had been collected. So in that sense, not at all. It failed to reach one of the objectives that was most exciting to the general public, which was the South Magnetic Pole. And there's many factors for that. I don't know that it's easy to pin the blame on any one person. one of the reasons there was many delays. There was a grounding in Beagle Channel in Tierra del Fuego. There was disciplinary problems on the way down that don't have an easy explanation. There was the fact that this was not a Navy ship, that they couldn't put the undisciplined members of the crew in shackles, for example. There's so many factors for these delays. The grounding in Beagle Channel required them to get more water. Then Racoviță and Arctovsky were so fascinated by what they saw in Tierra del Fuego that delayed the ship. So by the time they were trying to go from the Antarctic Peninsula all the way around the continent to Victoria Land, which is south of New Zealand, the winter ice was already starting to form, and it would have been impenetrable. And so that led de Gerlache to make the decision to pursue a southern course into the pack ice in the Bellingshausen Sea, which it possibly in view of seeing if there was open water behind it. He didn't know. I mean, this is the challenge of exploration, of being the first somewhere, is that you have no idea what's lying in store. And so with the blessing of Lecointe, the two decided to sail south, and eventually the ice gripped them, and the men suffered so that it was decided afterwards that a mission to complete to attain the South Magnetic Pole was not viable. So in that sense, yes, it did not reach this stated mission, which was something that people were very excited about. And there were two casualties, at least during the expedition, but I don't know that would qualify it as a failure. And in fact, the bounty, not only the scientific bounty, but the lessons for future polar explorers were extremely useful. And so that's far from a failure in my mind.
Thank you. It's so interesting that you point this out, because in fact, this is an approach in science that we change the mission objective depending on what we get. And it's so beautiful to read the beginning of your book when you explain how long it took to raise funds for such an important mission. And again, 125 years later in science, we have the same issue of raising funds to do good science. But I am hoping that you feel included in the science community, that it's absolutely clear that we need people like you. We need everybody. To me, it's always been this idea that the ship itself, everybody who put a nail in that ship contributed to the science today. And I think this is what we're trying to bring out, that science is not done in a vacuum, right? It needs everybody. It needs sailors, it needs engineers, it needs database people. Everybody's included. So it's not like science needs to be separate and elitist by any means. And we really benefit from people who take on the art, and people who take, like you, who just look at the history from a real perspective that appeals to the public. So if you'd like to say anything else about the book, and just with really deep thanks for what you have done. And I know it's a tremendous amount of work to write the book, and will you write another one?
Well, thank you for saying all that, and beautifully put about the contributions to science from non-scientists. Thank you for saying that. I am writing another one, and it also I'm writing about a sunken Spanish galleon and the billions that lie within, and I'm also realizing in this case as well, the great difficulties of raising the amount of money required for elaborate and dangerous scientific exploration. But I should also add that there's a Romanian and a French language version of Madhouse coming in the next, the French language edition's coming out in January, and Romanian, I believe, at the end of the year.
That's fantastic. Thank you very, very much again, Julian.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. It's an honor.
Same here. And it wouldn't be anybody better to exemplify the value of science that was collected on Belgica than Peter Conway. Unfortunately, Pete, he did send us a presentation, and he's for the moment in the southernmost part of Chile, we're actually in the Beagle Channel where Belgica crossed. So we are waiting for Pete to join us. He's probably on a flight right now. So if you don't mind, we'll delay his presentation until he joins us. He will speak about the Midge, Belgica, Antarctica. He's doing a lot of genomics and metagenomics and comparative genomics on this insect. But we are going to right now move to the next section of the symposium and another branch of the legacy that Racoviță left behind, which is speology. And this will be introduced by Dr. Ioana Nicoleta Meleg, who is a co-founder of the Emil Racoviță Foundation and also a co-founder of the Emil Racoviță Institute for Study of Life in Extreme Environments that was just founded newly in 2020. She's an ecologist and speleologist. Her current work focuses on inferring past population dynamics by combining ancient DNA research with paleological studies. Her work is so valuable. She was awarded fellowships by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and by Marie Curie of the European Union. And she says that her overarching aim in both her professional and private life is to promote ecology as a science that helps us steward the earth towards better times. So without further ado, thank you very much to the people who contributed, the speaker who contributed to Belgica, and I'm passing the microphone to Dr. Ioana Meleg.
Thank you, Anna. So this session will highlight Emil Racoviță's fundamental contributions to the study of caves as one of the extreme environments of the last century, which are now catalysts for exploration and discovery of this century's extreme environments, namely caves across our solar system. So our first speaker is Professor Ángel Iñez. He sent us a presentation. Ángel is a biologist and an avid caver who has conducted cave and karst research, particularly in the Balearic Islands, for the past 50 years. His main research interest has been focused on surface karst landforms, particularly Karen features, as well as geochronological investigations on deposits from coastal caves and their relationships with ancient sea levels.
This presentation is an updated overview about the celebrated cave of Mallorca, the Coves del Drac, and the presence of Typhlothilorana muragesi in its sea level water pools. There was in these phreatic coastal pools where Emil Racoviță found this crustacean and moved his interest from oceanography toward biospeology. Coves del Drac is developed on the upper Miocene reef that appear depicted here in yellow color. It is a very interesting tabular coastal karst which presents clear resemblances with the karst of Bermuda as an example. Let me show the first map of Coves del Drac after the old survey made by Friedrich Will. Note the three main chambers known from this time, whose dimensions and general trend are well represented in the map. Around the whole cave is drawn the presence of water pools, but the assumed connections between the pools were unreal. The successful explorations by Martel at the end of the 19th century and the discoveries of new chambers after navigating him through a great pool were crucial for Emil Racoviță's interest in visiting the cave. most of the show cave pathways used during the second half of the 20th century follow the impressive chambers found by Martel. All along the lower side of the map is displayed this part of the cave, from the so-called Martel's Lake to the artificial entrance. On the upper side of the map, the three chambers of the Ville's old survey can be easily recognized. Of course, there is no matter here for describe or enumerate the different sea level pools of the cave, but they are one of the most appealing features of the cave landscape. Martel's Lake, also known as Miramar Lake, is the longer sea pool of Covers del Drac. Let me outline here the changes performed in the surveys on the general pattern of this cave over the time. Note the spectacular increase in the exploration of the water passages during the last years. A few words more about the sea level pools in Covers del Drac, as well as on many other coastal caves in Mallorca. And a short remembering about the crucial visits of Emil Racoviță as oceanographer to Mallorca in 1904 and 1905. Obviously, the ecology of the assemblage of species living in these pools is an interesting subject in itself. Today, this kind of habitats, rich in peculiar species, are considered ankyline habitats. You can see at the right side of this schematic figure a simplified sketch of the coastal environments, including the alkaline mixing soil. Once again, some reflections concerning the distribution, the contribution of scuba divers that are also buried in the case of the Covers del Drac cave system. let me show another example from a cave located in the vicinity of Coverstal Drag. Note the strong difference in topographic pattern between the submerged part of the cave and the two collapsed areas accessible to normal cavers. And shown conclusive remarks regarding the changes in perception introduced by scuba diver explorations about these special karst caves developed in very porous rocks. The divide between the upper brackish waters and the deeper salty waters produce one or several stepped haloclines. Typhlophilorana moragesi tolerates a wide range of salinities, living even below the haloclines in completely marine waters. Tidal connectivity with the sea through conduits, bags, and matrix porosity of the rock is a fundamental topic regarding coastal speleogenesis, but it is also very important for alkaline habitats. The stratified water column in these littoral caves produces an increase of habitat diversity and generates several ecotones. The blue square is marking the deeper salt water environments that are recently supplying important faunal discoveries. And finally, this is only the moment to suggest some research goals for the future, based on the increasing knowledge that we are collecting in so special coastal karst caves, like the celebrated Coverstal Drag. Many thanks for your attention.
I think we can move on to the next presentation. That is also a video presentation. And it's about Emil Racoviță, the father of biospeleology, and will be presented by Professor Emeritus David Culver, who received his PhD at Yale University. And he has studied many aspects of the biology of subterranean fauna, particularly the distribution of hotspots of subterranean biodiversity worldwide. He is also studying the fauna of superficial subterranean habitats, such as sieves, that have many of the morphological features of cave animals, such as eyelessness and loss of pigment. Professor Culver is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
I want to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk about Emil Racoviță and the origins of speleology. By all accounts, He is the major figure in speleobiology in the early 20th century. While Racoviță had a long career in speleobiology, spanning several decades, it's his essay published in 1907 that we remember best. Here we see an image of the cover of a publication from the Racoviță Institute of Speleology with the first translations into English and Romanian, not until 2006. In spite of the recency of an English version, English-speaking speleobiologists have known of Racoviță as a result of the work of other biologists writing in English, particularly actually French speleobiologists. The essay was published very early in his career. He'd only been looking at caves and cave animals for 3 years when this came out. So the essay, which is a result of some field studies, but is really an essentially thorough review of the literature. And incidentally, I prefer the term speleobiology to biospeleology because to me, Racoviță and many that followed him was a biologist fascinated by the biological questions raised by cave animals rather than a speleologist fascinated by the animals in the caves. The essay is a wonderful summary of the main issues in speleobiology, what is known of them, and what the controversies are. To me, it's very much an essay of a young man, or more properly, a scientist beginning his study of cave animals, that young, where the errors of the elders are very much apparent. In the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about 4 major themes. The first is one that seems to be rarely noted. Racoviță is just fun to read. He's full of anecdotes, sharp criticisms, witticisms. The second is to try to place his work in some historical context and to point out that much as we might wish it were so, he is not the founder of speleobiology or biospeleology. Third, I want to emphasize and particularize his contributions to speleobiology. Contributions to our understanding of what the late ecologist G. Evelyn Hutchinson, one of the giants of 20th century ecology, called the ecological theater in which the evolutionary play takes place. And one of the themes I'll have is that it's really the ecological theater that Racoviță helps us understand. And finally, I will return to the theme that unlike contemporary, particularly North American neo-Lamarckians, he did not fall entirely into this trap. And so he's still worth reading these many decades later. Well, I've tried to, in this slide, try to give a sense of his writing style. It's certainly polemical, usually without being overly nasty, and it's one with great insight. I start with a quote that's perhaps the most famous point that Racoviță makes, which is that subterranean animals occur not just in large cave passages. So he says, as if the Lilliputian inhabitants of the subterranean environment care about gigantic domes, vast galleries, majestic passages. A simple crack of a few millimeters is enough for their welfare and the prosperity of their family. The second quote is more on a critique of the field. Poor stocks of observations, sometimes doubtful subjects, often uncontrolled, mostly from a long time ago, serve as greatly damaged weapons in the combat of theorists. It's fun to read, and you can imagine that this is written by somebody entering into the field and looking at what others that are more experienced have said and not being particularly impressed. Finally, just as an actual example of a criticism. He says the history of Tricus. Tricus is a cave beetle. Seems to me a legend that I cannot prevent myself from qualifying as childish, despite the esteem I avow for such a naturalist as Packard. Packard was a North American naturalist that wrote several decades before Racoviță. Well, this little timeline shows that Racoviță certainly did not invent the field. And even in North America, which trailed continental Europe, there were antecedents. And I put the North American examples up because this was the heart of the neo-Lamarckian view of evolution of cave animals. So we can sort of see some context for that. Start really with the founding of the American Naturalist, the highly prestigious journal. Most of us find it very difficult to get anything published in it, but in its origins, it had a number of articles about caves or cave animals, and it was actually founded by neo-Lamarckians, Cope of dinosaur fame and Packard of cave fame, as an outlet for discussions of neo-Lamarckianism. I think it's fair to say, aside from historians and scientists, relatively little insight to be gained from neo-Lamarckianism. Non-Darwinian evolutionary ideas continue to flourish, especially in Europe, with ideas like organicism, Judith Vandel, neutral evolution, Coswig, and Wilkins. Two publications I'll mention in a little bit. One is The Cave Fauna of North America, published by Packard in 1888. Then shortly after the publication of the essay by Racoviță, Carl Eigenmann publishes Cave Vertebrates of America in 1909. Weissman, in around 1910, debunks neo-Lamarckism, as does the rediscovery of Mendel at around the same time. There then follows a long period of quiet, at least in the North American side, and to a certain extent the European side as well. It's punctuated by the discovery of Astyanax, which is a cave fish that is a favorite study of people, experimentalists looking at eye loss. Finally, I put on here the 1960, which really heralds the start of the neo-Darwinian treatment of the cave fauna, and that we can date that to the publication of a special issue of American Midland Naturalist, Speciation and Raciation in Cavernicles. So what did Racoviță actually say about the subterranean environment? First and foremost, he expanded its realm from caves to include smaller cracks and fissures, both in the terrestrial realm, what we call now the milieu souterrain superficiel, the MSS, but also in the aquatic realm, the habitats we call epikarst and hyperie. These non-cave subterranean habitats continue to play a major role in the discovery of new species, as well as our understanding of the evolution and ecology of the subterranean. This idea was memorialized in the phrase the Racovićan impediment, along with other impediments like the Wallacean impediment, the Darwinian impediment, and so on. And in this case, it means the undercollecting of non-cave subterranean habitats. He also standardized and developed the terminology that we still use today to describe the ecological status of cave animals: troglazine, troglophile, and troglobite. these definitions and the actual terms continue to be a matter of debate, but it's he, along with Shiner, who really set the standard for that. And unlike his contemporaries, he really took an objective, careful view of the environment. And one of my favorites is when he talks about temperature, an area that I've actually quite interested in. He says, surely meteorologists armed with ultra-sensitive instruments will discover without a doubt that in absolute temperature variations can be considered important, but these variations are lower than those observed at surface. He goes on to say, local circumstances can also produce important temperature anomalies and variation in caves. He saw this temperature variation as unimportant, but he noted it. I would say that it actually is probably quite important. And it gives us a clue as to how animals in caves can diversify one from each other as well as simply converge. So he took a really prescient view of the environment, and one that saw that there was variation, but it was a subdued kind of variation. Also particularly interesting is his view about food supplies in caves, which are generally held to be very, very low. He argues that that's not always the case, and certainly think about organisms living in bat caves, that's the case. While that's still a point of contention, he really raises the issue in a very contemporary sort of way. And then I would just say also that he believed that there was a struggle for existence, and that there was evolution of cave animals, that they weren't just traps or senescent phyletic lines. And I won't really push that point further, but it allows his work to be sort of easily taken up by neo-Darwinians that appear a few decades later. So we come back now here to the question of why we keep reading Racoviță and don't read the more linguistically accessible Packard and Eigenmann. Packard wrote his monograph in 1888, and Eigenmann wrote his monograph in 1909. Parenthetically, I would say that Racoviță knew the work of both of them, and in fact refers to them in his essay. Packard is best remembered for species descriptions, especially in Mammoth Cave, and aside from species lists for all the caves that he knew about in 1880 North America, he elaborates neo-Lamarckian principles and focuses on ID generation, a favorite topic of neo-Lamarckian. A topic that's of perhaps little interest, at least in the way that he presented it nowadays. Eigenmann, in some ways, is a more interesting character, and he's now largely remembered for his very careful drawings of the anatomy of cavefish eyes, and he limited himself to fish and, to a certain extent, salamanders. So he had a less broad sweep of the evolution of cave animals than did Racoviță. Eigenmann did much of his work with his wife Rosa, who was also a highly skilled ichthyologist, one of the first women ichthyologists. So this just sort of repeats what I said. Racoviță really sets the stage for the North American neo-Darwinians with this nuanced view of the environment against the neo-Lamarckian view that it was either constant or irrelevant. So that I hope that this has given you some sense of why Racoviță is still read today. And finally, I'd just like to close by saying that everyone needs a patron saint. We, the Americans, can't really use Racoviță, I guess. So who better, since he's been taken, than Jack Daniels? Jack Daniels is a famous Tennessee sour mash whiskey. The water used to make it comes from a cave. The cave is protected. The cave water, according to Thomas Barr, one of the few people who've actually been allowed inside the cave, flows over back guano. Valerio Spardoni, the Italian speleobiologist, when I told him this, said, "Oh yes, of course. Now I understood why you could smell back guano when you sipped Jack Daniels." So next time you see or drink some Jack Daniels, think of the cave fauna and think of Racoviță and others. Thank you.
Okay, that's a new thing that we learned today. So the next talk then, till Bogdan will be back in, is from Dr. Penny Boston. She holds a PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder and is the director of NASA's Astrobiology Institute, for which she is fulfilling its mission to perform, support, and catalyze collaborative interdisciplinary astrobiology research. She is also responsible for training the next generation of astrobiologists, providing scientific and technical leadership for astrobiology space mission investigations, and developing new information technology approaches for collaborations among widely distributed investigators. Prior to joining NASA, Dr. Boston was professor and chair of the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department at the New Mexico Tech University and the associate director of the National Cave and Karst Institute in Carlsbad, New Mexico.
Greetings, everyone. This is Penny Boston, at home in New Mexico in the United States. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you on this occasion of the tribute to Racoviță in honor of the amazing scientific work that he did in his lifetime. And so I'm going to talk to you about the whole issue of caves on other planets and how that fits into the study of astrobiology, which is the study of trying to find evidence of life on other planets besides Earth. So that's the pathway we're going to take, and I'm going to do it as quickly as I can to just give you an overview, because the subject is, very complex, but I want to give you the main theme so you can have some appreciation for the breadth of this study. So I now work for NASA after a long career in academia, and within NASA and ESA and other space agencies around the world and the astrobiology community, we are focusing in two different directions. One is the solar system, other planetary bodies, including moons in our own solar system, and then secondly, astrobiology of exoplanets. And those are planets that circle other suns. I'm going to focus strictly on the solar system astrobiology because this is where caves come into play as potential habitat for organisms. So the job of astrobiology is really to track down any evidence of extraterrestrial life. And we spend a great deal of time trying to figure out how we look for it, how we recognize it. If we find it, how do we protect it? And how do we handle it so that we protect us on our home planet? So a great part of the work that the astrobiology community does is looking at organisms on Earth in extreme conditions. These usually focus on microorganisms, although there are some small invertebrates that are actually used as examples of very tough life forms that could potentially survive on another planet. One of the things that we have on our side while we're doing this in caves on Earth is that cave formation or speleogenesis has occurred in many different rock types on Earth. And you can see, if you just casually glance around this image composite, that there are examples in lava tubes, in volcanic regions, rock salt, granite, quartzite, marble, gypsum, even ice, and then many different ways or multiple different ways of making caves within carbonates like limestone. So all of those set the foundation for the kinds of geochemistries that life interacts with. So at the office, so to speak, the environments that I've worked in with my various team members are all very uncomfortable and very extreme for human beings, but the organisms that live there are highly adapted. So in this image, you can see an acidic environment on the upper left, a very cold environment with gases that are poisonous to us humans. In the upper right, very hot temperature environment. On the lower left, the Nika caves in Mexico, and very large cave decorations like we have in Fort Stanton Cave, which is just a couple of hours drive from my house here in New Mexico, where there are black streaks on the walls that you can see that are very unusual manganese using microorganisms. So one of the things that's really clear is that you don't need a cave the size of something that a human can get into to essentially be a cave for microorganisms. So-called saxicolous or rock inhabiting organisms abound on Earth. And you can see on the right 3 images that are tagged as endoliths. These organisms all grow within rocks, either between sand grains or sedimentary grains. Some of them actively bore into submerged rock, and some of them actively grow in fractures, and even some called hypoliths grow under rocks. So for them, those are actually caves. On the other end of the spectrum, we are also considering caves as potential human habitat for the moon and for Mars. As humans move out into that environment, they give a significant amount of protection against ionizing radiation, of course, ultraviolet, and also potentially can hold air. So I want to focus for a moment on what kind of planet we're talking about. So here on Earth, we have what I call a type 1 biosphere, which is sunlight driven. Photosynthesis is the process that drives the life here, and it's a really obvious planet with life. It shows signs of life chemically and spectroscopically all over its surface. And so it's easy, if you were an alien astrobiologist, to figure out that life exists on Earth. But the rest of the bodies in our solar system, including Mars and icy moons, circling around gas giants, are much more cryptic. There's no obvious life visible on the surface. Therefore, you have to conclude that any life there would have to be subsurface. And because of that, sunlight is not going to provide the ability for photosynthesis to be a significant component, or any component of such a biosystem, should it exist on any of these bodies. And so they would have to be chemosynthetically driven, which means making chemical transformations of rocks, minerals, gases, and so forth, not living off organic material produced by plants by using sunlight. So the moon, since 2009, positive identifications of well over 200 volcanic cave features. Some are big pits, like you see here. Some are lava tubes coming off lava rills. And of course, we just launched the Artemis 1 spacecraft last night as I record this, and with significant international plans to go back to the moon for permanent stays and permanent research. The case of Mars is even more exciting. Although a bit farther into our future, we now have over 2,400 features identified that are cave pits, like the giant pits that you see here. A lot of these are more than 100 meters wide, the one in the upper right-hand corner being bigger than a football field, both American or your soccer field, and lava tubes with collapsed sections and holes going into them. So the case of Mars is very exciting for the potential for subsurface habitat. There is even the potential for non-volcanic caves on Mars. This observation by Natalie Cabral and Edmond Grin a number of years ago looks at a sedimentary system and sees a big giant chasm entrance into that. This is the best resolution that we have on this feature. It remains to be explored in the future. One of the things that I think is particularly important is to think of the icy satellites with these thick icy crusts that circle around the gas giant planets Jupiter and Saturn, not as ocean worlds, but as planet-sized aqueous caves, because they are entirely roofed by ice. The cave potential on these icy bodies is a number of different places. So the water-filled cavity that you can see here that I'm pointing to with the cursor is the very largest potential habitat for life in this environment, but there are many others. So pressure melt lenses like this that we know here on Earth from Antarctica, plumes that are surface towers with cave structures underneath them that we also have here on Antarctica, fracture cavities like in glaciers, surface cavities like in the Mount Rainier case and other mountains around the world, and even cavities underneath where there are plumes coming out. These are clearly visible on Enceladus, and they may be present on Europa. One of the things that you have to ask when you talk about trying to access some sites like this is, can you get into them? How do you get through icy terrain that is many kilometers thick in order to get to some of these cavities or even the interior liquid ocean that I pointed to in the previous slide? Many robotics groups around the world are trying to look at how to do those kinds of entries robotically. One of the issues that we have faced as we try to look at subsurface microorganisms on Earth and think about them with respect to other planets is what are they doing there? How did they get there? Is it a very sparse environment? Is it a major chunk of the biosphere? And gradually over the 30 years that I've been working on this stuff, I've changed my thinking from answer A on the left-hand side, which is evolutionary losers who have to retreat to the subsurface because they can't outcompete better adapted organisms on the surface, to thinking that really what we're looking at is a permanent microbial subterranean biosphere of great antiquity. Some people have even suggested that early life may have taken hold in the subsurface. That's a much harder question to investigate, but nevertheless interesting to think about. So I'm going to finish up here by simply giving you a tour very quickly through different environments in which microorganisms are making significant visible differences within a cave environment. These are all carbonate biofilms. Biofilms are gooey to mineral encrusted things that microorganisms produce in caves. Every one of these is the result of microorganisms in a largely carbonate setting. Iron is very popular with microorganisms. They can oxidize it for energy, and you produce iron oxides as a byproduct, and you can see examples of this from all over the world. Manganese is particularly significant because it is not easy to oxidize chemically under typical Earth surface conditions, including cave conditions, and so microorganisms are very much dryers in altering that material to precipitate it out as oxidized manganese minerals, and you can see various examples here. Copper, which is toxic to many life forms of the kind that we are, is actually something that many microbes can tolerate, and they can use copper sulfides where they cleave the sulfide off and use that as their energy metabolism, and as a byproduct they produce a whole array of copper minerals. One of the good things that happens is that there's lithified biofilm and microfossils, so we can look at ancient examples of microbial life in caves. We find them preserved in pool fingers and drapey structures and even whole body fossils of the microbes when we etch the limestone. Biopatterning is something that microorganisms do. It's a self-organizing process that allows them to maximize their availability to fluids and the nutrients that fluids contain. So to wrap up here, there are a number of different unifying themes that we have discovered over many years studying a number of different kinds of microbial subsurface systems. And the key here is not the individual things that I have on the slide, but the fact that no matter what the geochemistry is and no matter what the organisms are using for energy, there are a whole lot of significant ecologically similar processes that are undertaken. And with that, I will wind up and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
The next talk will be about speleology, a look into its past and future. And it will be presented by Professor Bogdan Onac. He's one of the co-founders of the Emil Racoviță Foundation. His research interests center on reconstructed climate and paleo-environmental changes using speleothems, ice, and guano from various cave and karst deposits. He employs mineralogy, stable, and radiogenic isotope geochemistry to answer his research questions. A particular aspect of his current and future studies is to contribute data on past sea level positions for both warmer and colder periods of Earth's history using carbonate incrustations from littoral caves. He is currently professor of karst geology and paleoclimate in the School of Geosciences at the University of South Florida, USA, and adjunct research professor at the Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj-Napoca, Romania.
So thank you for giving me the opportunity to have a very brief, really very brief overview of what happened in the past and what's the future for speleology. And it's really a very, very brief look to this because it's a very complex subject. So speleology, the science of caves, I was also always fascinated about what actually drove humans getting into caves, and probably curiosity was one of the main reasons, trying to find out what's behind that black dark entrance into a mountain. Rituals we found out later that were related to caves, and various civilizations use in different ways caves for their rituals. Then humans start doing some exploration, and we call exploration since they were just going inside the cave, probably looking to see whether it's a appropriate shelter for the cold days or rainy days, or just a place where they can display whatever they see outside, and left us very, very meaningful cave art. But we do have documentations that it's going back about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago that humans actually enter caves to collect water that was dripping from the ceiling. And we know that for sure in the Southwest United States, that actually the ancestral Pueblos, the American Indians, went into some of these lava tubes that exist 2,000 years ago and melt ice to get their water. Another reason the humans went into the cave was to look for raw materials, clay, salts, all kind of other things that they were using in a daily basis. Then at one point, somebody noticed, well, we can draw people coming into and visiting this cave, and so that recreation and tourists took off. And at the beginning, as I will show later, it was primitive, but basically that was an industry that was built right there. Nowadays, some of the caves can do both of them, research and recreation. Grotta Gigante, it's a beautiful example in northern Italy, where you have a gigantic room with a path for tourists, but also sensitive instruments that measures and monitor earth tides. Well, if you look at as I mentioned, the tourism across centuries, at the very early time, people were fancy dressed to get into the cave because this was like a huge adventure. And you have the guide or one of the family members having a torch to light everything. Primitive structures, infrastructure for visiting the caves, but apparently that was enough for the time being. Nobody actually realized at that time how bad torches were doing to the cave environment. And it took some time before we figured that out. And as we start moving on and caves were, larger caves were developed for tourism, now we have big avenues, paved avenues in caves like Mammoth Cave, dining rooms, deep inside the caves, incredible structures to climb up and down to see some of the features that otherwise would be impossible, trains to get us faster to the areas that caves it's most important, even elevators for caves that are deep, like in Carlsbad Caverns, and in most of these fancy touristic caves, now restrooms needs to be inside the cave. So it's a huge jump from this family gathering and visit the first 100 meters, 200 meters of a cave to caves that nowadays you have to take the train to go there. But for the humans to do the exploration, equipment was something extremely important. And again, everything started with your torch, and they realized they cannot go too far to do anything. Then lanterns came, the flame was confined. So if the wind was blowing in the cave, your light was still on. Carbide lamp came later on. There was a huge disadvantage still because you had to carry in your hand. And so if you had to climb or go down on a rope, it was really not something that you wanted. And so people realized that the lamp on front of the helmet, it's really leaving you two hands to work, but the helmet will come up into your face. Petzl, a French outdoor company, created this ingenious system where the light was coming up at your helmet. You even had a piezoelectric system to flame it up, and everything was fine for a couple of decades before we moved with the technology into lithium-ion batteries, powerful LEDs that gives you now almost 100 hours to go underground and do exploration, and even have a UV LED so that you can see minerals in UV light in the caves. Part of the exploration was also the gear that you use for especially the deep caves. And that is mainly because early time, like this example here from Kumpenaska Cave, you had to use very heavy equipment, ladders, ropes, and it was pretty difficult and it was time consuming. Nowadays with Petzl and other companies that improve the gear for the equipment to go into the cave, now it's much easier to access deep caves. And that's one of the reasons why we are now at more than 2 kilometers below surface in at least 2 of the caves in the Republic of Georgia. And exploration, probably that is not that much of this vertical gear, but lightning and everything else made Mammoth Cave system now reaching 676 kilometers. Well, for cavers, speleologists to pass the information about what they found into, it was important at one point when the science started to change things from a technological point of view. If at the beginning we had the size microscope that the Racoviță used in the Belgica expedition, now we have digital microscopes, instruments large that you need 1 or 2 big rooms to set them down to measure stable isotopes in water, in carbonates, and so forth. Now you only need an instrument of this size that you have it here. So really small scale, the technology brought that. And what this did to speleology, allow for those who wanted to do research, not only to be able at the beginning to get the sample out of the cave and measure them in the lab, but now you can basically take the instrument down into the cave and definitely in the field. A chemical instrument, an XRF, which is an X-ray fluorescent spectrometer. Now it's as small as it's a handheld, and you just point it to your sample and you can get on the screen everything you want. That's really amazing. And as you will see at the end, I'll come back to this slide because that catalyzed what Penny Boston was just talking about. Now, going back to some of the Racoviță's original, or let's say not original, but things that, places that started something. 1904, Covezel-Drac essayed the biospeology with the Tiflocerolana being discovered right there. it's amazing because even at 1904, Cueva del Drac, although it was very little known out of it, it was already a miracle because of the lakes on the ground and so forth. Nowadays, the cave takes over 1 million tourists per year. It's one of the most visited caves in the world. But in the same time, they do a lot of paleoclimate and especially sea level changes studies and that is mainly because the speleothems, the cave formation that form in these coastal caves are very unique and allows to reconstruct sea level fluctuation at a precision of a couple of centimeters, which is tremendous. The second place that Racoviță visited once he established the Speological Institute in Cluj was Scărișoara Ice Cave. And he visited 4 times and left in 1927. He wrote this only physical speleology paper on observation on the ice cave of Scărișoara. He has beautiful drawings in his notebook about the ice, about the cave, where you can go, how big the ice block was at the time that he was visiting. And he left behind a couple of statements very similar to those Dave Culver mentioned, but they were strictly related to Scărișoara in that he saw in this cave a unique phenomenon that needs to be investigated, and not only by geologists, but crystallographer, meteorologists, physiologists, biologists, and so forth, to bring up all the secrets that the ice block really have inside. And this is this was considered, at least for those working in the Speological Institute, as a testament. And so they started to do, and we see that over years, there was a lot of information that came off of the Scărișoara ice cave, with ice core recovered from the main room, 23 meters of ice that allowed a very precise reconstruction of the last 10,000 years of climate. But then also looking at other speleothems, cave pearls that originally was studied with nail polish to see whether they move or not, up to minerals that were for the first time discovered in caves like icite, which is a very sensitive, temperature-sensitive mineral at more than 4 degrees centigrade, the mineral transforms in calcite and disappears. And for these kinds of research, we used very performant instruments that allowed us to measure and investigate the mineral right there in cave without the need to take them out. Also in the ice, biospeleologists, biologists studied microbiology, bacteria, fungi, DNA, and there are lots of papers and enigmas that are still in process of studying. Back in 2000, with the occasion of another symposium, the Speological Institute, Gheorghe Racoviță, along with me, we compiled, everything was written about the Scărișoara ice cave, again, as being a testament that Emil Racoviță left for those who were interested in studying the glacier, the ice. And so I just copy-paste here a number of titles and papers. There are lots of them that came out since 2000. And so I would say Racoviță's legacy really remains vivid. And this legacy, it's what probably drove the Babeș-Bolyai University to create an institute for studying extreme life in extreme conditions, especially because it's interested in mixing and producing transformative and innovative and multidisciplinary studies, and allowing by this research to get into better understanding of the physical, social, psychosocial environments, everything that is related to these boundary conditions in some of the extreme condition environments, from the bottom of the ocean up to the outer space. And with that, coming back to this image, and this presentation should have been before Penny, so I would have introduced her. But this creating smaller and smaller instruments, it had several reasons, but one of them was to allow people to take the instruments in the field. Then they realized, okay, we can fly we can fly instruments on Mars and on Moon. Okay, for those we need even smaller size. So this small rover right here, it's loaded with such small scale instruments that allow measurements of various kinds on the red planet there. And why would that be interesting for speleology? Well, it is because apparently, as Penny mentioned, speleology, it moves out into the outer space. And that is mainly because of the lava tubes that we are studying now on the Earth. And we know the existence of these lava tubes on other places, Moon and Mars. And you can check on this diagram right here that was last year published, that there are several other planets and satellites where subsurface access points, so small collapses of the ceiling of the lava tubes occur. And so they're in kind of inventory of this. So the next step would be for these ones to be characterized better, trying to get better imaging of the entrances and maybe something that you can see inside. But the real next step is creating robots and drones that are equipped with the small size instruments, allow them to go inside and see what's inside the atmosphere, what the concentration of gases is. Is there any traces of life? Is there water source inside? It could be underneath the surface because of the being shielded for the UV and temperature and so forth. There might be liquid or solid water, ice, and obviously the final reason I would say is to make sure that these underground environments are good for habitation, places where Mars or Moon missions can take people and create research bases there in the, well, I would say distant future. So speleology, I mean, it's really a lot of things to say about, but I would summarize and in having increasing and improving the lighting system, the equipment to get into the cave deeper and deeper, and the technology, the interdisciplinarity work between engineers, scientists, and whoever, inventors, create these small size instruments that allows us to take them into the caves, into remote places, deep in the oceans, volcanoes, and so forth, that kind of makes the life of speleologists or the scientific speleologists a little bit better, allowing them to collect and interpret data from extreme environments. Lava tubes being one of that. And I thank you for attention.
Thank you, Bogdan. I would say we can take a question, one question.
Yeah, Bogdan, I have a question. Makes me curious. You've been around speleology for many years now, and as you presented, the technology has changed so quickly. If you look back, is there one thing that you would have done differently now, knowing the technology today? Because sometimes we feel like we spend a lot of time in science doing things, and then 10 years later, we can do exactly the same thing in much less time.
Well, that's a good question. I would say now that I'm looking back, I started to learn that in, I don't know, probably 5-10 years into start doing real science in caves, is that once you collect a sample, you need to document it very well and preserve that sample, because you never know when you go back. And it turns out that now having samples that I collected before even getting in college, it's so useful because I can use them. At that time, there was just no way that I could do a chemical analysis because I would have destroyed everything. And even for my PhD, if I look back, I use stalagmites and I would take like 10, 15 milligrams or grams out of it because the instruments were at that level. Now I need a few micrograms and I would do a better job. So I would say, yeah, I would have done a lot of things, but I'm in a way happy that I thought about building my own repository of minerals. And so I'm like 2,000 something samples, for instance, and I can go back to those and do things that probably I've done with a less performant instrument. And now I can do that with much better stuff. So I would say for those who are doing research, always should think about that. And yeah.
Thank you. And that's certainly the perfect example of what probably Penny Boston is dealing with every day, sample return missions and the cost of a mission in space. Would you be able to address a little bit this issue of the cost versus the investment versus what we get back, investment on return?
It's a lot of money. But one of the important things about the effort to go and do cave exploration on other planets is that we're, driving the technology. And compared to a surface rover, mission, which are, wonderful and producing great science, but they're still very cumbersome. We're still trundling around on other planets on wheels and so forth. And clearly what we need to be able to study the subsurface of another planet either involves drilling or it involves getting into natural cavities. And both of them are very challenging. But we have great hopes for getting into lunar cavities, relatively soon, within the next 20 years, not because of astrobiology, because we don't expect any native life on the moon, but because just looking at the history of the moon through the stratigraphy that would be exposed within a pit is something that we can't currently do. So there are many different reasons for doing that science. And of course, on Mars, since the early 90s, I have, written about the fact that if you were going to find anything still alive, or maybe even convincing remains of life, traces of life having been present on Mars, you would have to go into the subsurface, because even anything exposed on the surface is going to be destroyed by the extremely harsh radiation environment, the meteorite and micrometeorite impact. The solar wind, all of these factors are going to even render surface exposed traces very hard to understand. So the cost is very high, but at the same time, we're advancing science on the Earth in support of this. And so a lot of these analog studies, including the ones in caves, are actually funded within the astrobiology program and within the human exploration program. So yes, it's a lot of money, but compared to what we spend everyone on Earth on our, military and defense budgets, it's a tiny drop in the bucket. So, I personally think it's worth it for driving the science forward.
Thank you. And actually, I do have one more question for you, because it seems to me that you are just such a wonderful example of both science and exploration. You've been in so many places and extreme environments on this planet, and you're also a wonderful teacher and mentor of many students. So just as Racoviță was an explorer and a scientist and a mentor, what would be, from this amazing career that you have, a few words to students and the future generation that is trying to step into big steps, into big shoes?
Well, the only thing that's kept me going through rough times is that I love being a beginner at things. And that has allowed me to move into different fields, because I'm not afraid to be the person in the room that knows the least about whatever's going on. And, so that characteristic that many people lose when they stop being kids, I've actively cultivated. And so I'm not afraid to just hair off doing something that I've never done before. And that's what got me into caves. I wasn't a caver. I wasn't a recreational caver. I just thought, gee, Mars, the subsurface, gee, where would I go on Earth? Drilling is expensive and hard. What about caves? And that was what, pulled me into caves. And of course, then I discovered that they were far more amazing, rich, and and varied than I had any, notion of as someone who had just been in show caves as a kid. So that ability to embrace your inner beginner, I think, is really what's allowed me to survive. Academia is not easy. NASA is very not easy environment in order to, live. And yeah, it requires a lot of patience. So, and probably the way I would sum it up is, pursue what you want. You will find a way to get somebody to pay you to do it.
Thank you so much, Penny, for joining us today and for all the wonderful advice and reminding us that we have to keep playful and curious. Did you wanna?
Thank you. So moving on.
The wonderful segue in the next talk by Călin Cașcaval.
So the next speaker is Călin Cașcaval. Călin is Director of Engineering at Google Research and, as one of the scientist's great-grandsons, a co-founder of the Emil Racoviță Foundation for Science and Exploration in Extreme Environments. He identified industry trends, defined, built, and delivered first-of-a-kind prototypes and products at IBM, Qualcomm, and Barefoot. He is also the holder of 38 awarded patents. He will speak today about the Racoviță Foundation's goal to create opportunities for new generations. Călin, Zoom is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure. So I'm Călin Cașcaval, and like Iona said, I'm one of the scientists' great-grandsons. First of all, well, I'm here really to closing, so sorry for being late, and we'll wrap it up. So that we have you going on your way. But I do want to thank you all for joining this event and honoring the legacy of a great scientist and mentor. I'm really grateful to the hosts and presenters for all the time and effort they put into making this a fantastic celebration. And I certainly appreciate your participation and patience with us. So we heard about Racoviță's pioneering work in biospeology and about his first-of-a-kind exploration. We heard about his contributions to science and education in Romania and internationally. He was a rector of the University at Cluj and president of the Romanian Academy. But there is an aspect of his contributions that it's often overlooked: his mentoring. He was a teacher and a mentor by excellence. I mean, the number of functions, administrative functions that he accepted just in order to enable access to learning was astonishing. He taught with passion throughout his whole life. During the war, I mean, he was retired, yet he spent time to mentor the collective at the department and try to ensure that learning continues in the department. I think the whole mentoring is best illustrated by his bequest that he leaves to the young people in his academic will, which reads like, "I will leave you with love for your country and its language, love for science, complete trust in the scientific method, the courage to always tell the truth regardless of circumstances, and lastly, boundless optimism based on the faith that humanity is not as stupid as to dig its own grave." I mean, he was a visionary indeed. So we established the Racoviță Foundation for Science and Exploration of Extreme Environments with two main goals in mind. One is promoting Racoviță's legacy of education and mentoring young researchers. We have a really grand vision and currently a very small but dedicated and enthusiastic group of people to build an organization that will generate exciting projects and support new generations of researchers to stay curious and create the same kind of opportunities that Racoviță had with the Antarctic expedition. And the other one is to actually preserve, digitize, and disseminate his work and contributions to science and society. We live in a digital world, a much more accessible, smaller world than it was during his time. His efforts to create international movements and communities involved writing letters, and that would take weeks to reach their destination. Today, with email and instant messaging, this is a lot easier. So easy that we tend to ignore it. When in fact, the effort that it takes to build international communities is by no means any smaller than during his time. And we believe that following in his footsteps, raising awareness, building international communities is the honor that his timeless legacy deserves. So, should you decide to help to accomplish this vision, please get in touch and let us know. And I want to thank you once more for your time and attention and patience with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. Juana, shall we move on with Pete's?
And we do have one presentation from Pete Conway, who works on Belgica Antarctica. So we're going to turn it sort of round full circle. We realize that it's past the time that was allotted, but if you are very welcome to stay. Can you bring Pete's presentation, please? He is probably on his flight to Chile right now. He was kind enough to send us the presentation ahead of time. Pete Conway is a terrestrial ecologist with more than 34 years experience with the British Antarctic Survey. And something amazing that Pete has that I think very few people on this planet can boast is a record of 19 Antarctic summers and 1 winter, and also multiple Arctic periods of teaching and research in Svalbard, Greenland, and Russia. He's an individual merit senior research scientist at the British Antarctic Survey, where he leads the core of biodiversity evolution and adaptation team. He's part of the science management team responsible for international interactions. And he's really a pioneer of all programs Antarctic. If you look at his bio, basically all these programs that are driven through the scientific community on Antarctic research are evolution and biodiversity, regional sensitivity to climate change, state of the Antarctic ecosystem, and the Antarctic, the advisory group on Antarctic climate change and the environment. So he's really one of the people who brings up the fact that climate affects the whole globe, and working at the poles is really important for us to understand the past and the future of the planet. He's also a lecturer in many different places, University of Birmingham, across the globe, University of Birmingham, Malaysia, New Zealand, and South Africa. And here are the 2 maps are actually his connections all over the world, first in the UK and then all over the world. He's right here right now where you see that arrow right there. Hopefully maybe he will join us during the talk, but we are ready to actually present his talk. That is a collaboration with Irina Kozeretskaya from Ukraine, who's also working in the Antarctic. So he and Irina spent these last few days while both on travel across the world to put together this wonderful presentation on an insect that Emil Racoviță collected many years ago, and who also Olivier spoke about. So Pete? Just need the sound.
It's also exciting for me to be involved in a meeting that has a family connection to one of the original discoverers of terrestrial biology in the Antarctic. If you're listening to this recorded version, that means I'm unfortunately not being able to make connection to you from southern Chile. I should say I'm working at the moment on Navarino Island near the Beagle Channel, which is where the Belgica expedition actually started making some of its collections in the Antarctic region. What I've been asked to talk about today, what I'd like to try and give you some information about, is a rather unusual insect called Belgica antarctica, genus name obviously after the expedition, which is the only true insect that naturally occurs on the Antarctic continent. The Belgica expedition, I guess, had presentations that give a lot more detail on that in itself. Right at the end of the 19th century, it was one of the first scientific expeditions to explore the western coast of the Antarctic Peninsula, which is what we remember it for. It also did quite extensive work in the far south of South America, in the southern Patagonian channels around the Cape Horn archipelago. On board was Emil Racoviță, who was responsible for making some of the first collections of a number of the terrestrial invertebrates that exist on the Antarctic continent. He wasn't the taxonomist who described them. He collected them and he passed them on. He passed them on, particularly the insects, he passed on to a taxonomist called Jacobs, who made formal taxonomic descriptions of a number of these species. In particular, this wingless fly, Belgica antarctica, is a chironomid midge. It's the same family as the swarms of midges that you see flying around riverbanks and under trees in Europe and elsewhere in the world. This was the first insect to be described from the Antarctic continent, and we actually now know that it's the only true insect present on the Antarctic continent. It's only about 0.5 centimetre long as an adult. The larvae do get slightly longer than that. And it is the continent's largest terrestrial animal by nearly an order of magnitude. It's quite a significant animal in the context of Antarctic terrestrial diversity. That happened right at the end of the 19th century, and it wasn't until the mid-20th century, certainly after the Second World War, and really after the 1957-58 International Geophysical Year, that scientific research really kicked off in earnest in Antarctica. In the Antarctic Peninsula region, Belgica antarctica actually became a central focus of terrestrial research in the region, with scientists looking at its ecology, its life cycle, how it was specialized to what was seen as the very extreme environment of the Antarctic. It means there's over the last 40, 50 years, a pretty good body of biochemical and physiological research has been carried out looking at adaptations to the environmental stresses that characterize the Antarctic. In recent years, that has provided a foundation to the application of current cutting-edge molecular techniques, genomics, and other omics. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about them later, but I don't want to go into vast amount of detail of that. But this is a core organism that's being used for this sort of research in the Antarctic. Most people aren't familiar with the Antarctic having a terrestrial fauna, a land fauna. Penguins and seals belong in the marine environment. They count as part of the marine ecosystem. So when I say I'm a terrestrial researcher in the Antarctic, most people look blank at me and they say there is no terrestrial research in the Antarctic because there's nothing terrestrial, is there? Question mark. And the Antarctic terrestrial fauna is certainly pretty limited. It's pretty minor. There are not a large number of species. Those species are small. They're not iconic in the sense that a penguin is, but it's there, and we increasingly realize it's been there for a very long time and evolved and adapted to that environment for a very long time. The fauna overall consists of 2 diptera, and I know I've said that Belgica is the only one native to the Antarctic continent. There is a second dipteran that occurs on the offshore South Shetland Islands. It doesn't occur on the peninsula or the continent. So technically there are 2 diptera in Antarctica, but only one on the continent. Most of the terrestrial fauna are the mites and springtails, the left hand and the central picture at the bottom here, and then a range of microinvertebrates illustrated the tardigrade here, but also rotifers, nematodes, and even smaller protists. As a side note, if you look at the central picture at the bottom, you'll see that there are 2 species of mites there. The black one is one called Alaskazetes. It's an oribatid mite. It's the second largest terrestrial invertebrate in the Antarctic. And it's an algal grazing oribatid mite. Now, we may say Antarctic systems are unusual, but you can relate them to other ecosystems. They've got all the same sorts of things: producers, consumers, predators, and so on. Alaskazetes is effectively the elephant in this ecosystem. And the springtails at the bottom left are effectively, they're also algal grazers, are effectively the gazelle. So the orange mite is actually named Gamacellus racovicae. It's actually named in honor of the subject of your meeting. This is one of the only predatory mites in the Antarctic. It doesn't actually predate those black mites, it predates the springtails. And you could regard that as the lion of the ecosystem. So there is, although these things look simple, there is the same ecosystem structure to what you get elsewhere. All of this fauna remains in place year-round. They're obviously not migratory. That means they have to be adapted to the conditions they face year-round in the region. They, even though small, they are key contributors to the existing processes and functions in this region. And a particularly important one there is decomposition, breaking things down, releasing nutrients back for future use for organisms. Decomposition is a rate-limiting process in Antarctica. I'll come back to that if I remember later on. Like virtually all ecosystems, only a minority of species have been studied in any detail, whether that be in the field or the laboratory, but they are typified by extremely well-developed stress-tolerant adaptations. So, you were wondering I was going to introduce you to Belgica at all. This is the fly we're talking about. So 2 pictures of mating pairs. You can see that they are sexually dimorphic. The males are smaller, actually a lot more active. The females, containing the egg load obviously, are probably twice to 3 times the mass of the male, more or less the same physical dimensions. They are wingless. I quite often get pictures from visitors to the Antarctic saying, oh, look, I found an ant in the Antarctic, because they run around on the ground surface. And at first sight, they do look very like ants, but they are actually chironomid midges. They have extremely reduced wings. They've not entirely lost their wings. They are extremely reduced. So they're called brachypterous is the scientific word for it. The larvae are typical midge larvae, little maggot-like things up the top left. And as I'll show in the next slide, they can be found in a wide range of habitats. They are very tolerant of submergence in freshwater, actually also in seawater. So they do tend to live in moist rather than drier environments. Where do we find it? This map, I put this map early in the talk. I'm actually going to come back to part of it later in the talk. So remember the right-hand side of the map for later, particularly the South Orkney Islands and Possession Island, the Crozet Archipelago at the bottom right. But the range for Belgica Antarctica is on the Antarctic Peninsula, and it is specifically on the Western Antarctic Peninsula. This map is taken from a genetic study of the species, which highlights that there are different so-called haplogroups, different subgroups within the species. That's not something I'm going to go into any more detail here. But fly is distributed all the way along the Western Antarctic Peninsula, as far as this map goes, down to around Adelaide Island, which is this island here. There are actually a few records. We've not managed to go back and confirm them from the Antarctic Peninsula further south here. The furthest south record is from Lazarus Bay on Alexander Island, which is round about where my pointer is now. And you can see it very bottom left, bigger. Belgica also occurs, it's not shown. But this is the only place or the only part of the world it occurs, which means it's what's called endemic to that region. Now, the reason for these ones on the right will become clear later. A relative has been introduced here on Cygne Island, South Orkney Islands, and another member of the genus occurs all the way around here in the sub-Antarctic Indian Ocean on the Crozet Islands. Back to that. What sort of habitats does it live in? Well, this is actually a set of pictures of fairly typical Antarctic terrestrial habitats from the Antarctic Peninsula. When it was first found, and because these habitats are common near research stations where researchers work on the species, it's often said there's an association with penguin breeding species, where you get a lot of organic matter around the colonies, you get a lot of algal development around the colony, and the algae in particular is a very good habitat. So for a long time, there was an assumption that it was actually associated strictly with penguin-enriched areas. That's actually not the case. It is associated with moss mats, moss carpets that grow quite widely in some areas along the Antarctic Peninsula. Picture at the top right here, that is actually me, believe it or not. This is just illustrating that it was actually very common. I was hand catching adults on these rock surfaces. Bit of organic matter in the crevices, but the rock surfaces are obviously there. And it shows, in a way, the ease of collecting something, even though I'm employing a helicopter to get to my field site. And again, a colleague collecting at the bottom right here. It also occurs in wet habitats or around wet habitats. So this is like algal growth, cyanobacterial growth in a small drainage channel, which provide habitat for larvae. So it's actually quite widespread. when you know what. Now, I've mentioned that Belgica has been used in a very wide range of biological disciplines to study adaptation. I'm not going to go into more detail about it this talk. I'm going to pick on, if you like, a pet subject or a favourite subject of the research I'm involved in, because that has ramifications for lots of subjects. And this stems from the fact that Belgica is endemic to the Antarctic Peninsula. If it's endemic to somewhere, the obvious question is how long has it been there, and how is it related to other species in the same general group elsewhere, initially in sort of South America, South Atlantic region. You can take that question more widely. This is a subject that has become a lot easier to address with the advent of molecular biology. And in the early 2000s, what's commonly called a molecular clock approach was applied to a number of fly species in the Antarctic Peninsula, Scotia Arc, Southern South America region. Molecular clocks are a way of looking at the rate of accumulation of mutations in DNA. So that you sequence particular genes, you basically see how many changes there have been at the time. And broadly, you can say that mutations happen at a certain rate, a certain number of base changes happen every million years, let's say. When this was done in the early 2000s, the broad general assumption is that all terrestrial biology in Antarctica was actually probably post-glacial in its origin. It would have colonized from somewhere to the north as ice retreated to the last glacial maximum. So when this was first done, the expectation is that divergence dates would come in the tens, possibly thousands of years. Thus, the assumption was everything was actually fairly recent in the region. And to cut a long story short, this study, which looked at 3 species, in the Belgica in the Antarctic Peninsula, it looked at a species called Eremoptera, back to South Georgia, or originating on South Georgia, but actually introduced to the South Orkney Islands. And it looked at a related species up here in Tierra del Fuego, the southern tip. And the important result is that it found the divergence between Belgica and Eremoptera came out at 40 to 50 million years ago. This was the early days of molecular clock studies. There are quite large error bars on that figure, but it is tens of millions of years. The significance of the finding is that it's tens of millions of years. And however big the error bars are, you can't turn that into tens of thousands of years. It's also possibly coincident with the geological separation of land in these regions. If you wind the geology clock back 30 years, the Antarctic Peninsula was joined to the southern tip of South America. South Georgia, which is now way over here, was nestled right in the middle of it. So we're beginning to get an implication that you've got a biological confirmation of the geological theory of separation of South. That's Belgica Antarctica. Now, my remit was Belgica Antarctica. I'm going to say, are there other Belgican species? And that leads or opens up a whole field of new research. The Belgica expedition, as I mentioned, first sampled in the Beagle Channel and around the Cape Horn archipelago. This is a region that's now known as the Magellanic Subantarctic region. It has a climate that is comparable to the other subantarctic climate. In the Beagle Channel, Racoviță sampled another winged fly. This is actually a picture of it from a recent study. And Jacobs described it, and he first described it as another Belgica species, described it as Belgica Magellanic. Now, taxonomy changes, taxonomy develops, so much more is known about the taxonomy of the corallid family. So this species has now changed genus. It is still in the same part of the corallid family as Belgica, but it's not as closely related to be in the same genus. It's now known as Talmatogeta Magellanicus. After its first discovery, it was never even noted again until 2015, when one of my Chilean collaborators working in Puerto Williams found it on a beach. We were all excited about it, and we suddenly realized that we knew what we could find out what it was. Subsequent to that, we had a PhD student, Nicholas Samoa's working on it, and in 2017, it was surveyed in some detail on Navarino Island, which is a big island south of the Beagle Channel. The map at the bottom shows where we have positive records of species in that area. It is also now known from a number of locations on the north side of Beagle Channel, and also from Falkland Islands off the east of the South American. So it isn't a Belgica now. It was first described by a Belgica, and that was from specimens collected in the Belgica. If we move on to South Georgia, and we've already seen this picture, this thing called Eretmotra. Now, how much detail you can see depends on how big your screen is that you're looking at. But this species looks extremely like Belgica. If you put the two next to each other, you might struggle to separate. It is another wingless endemic niche, this time from subantarctic South Georgia origin. Again, it is endemic to that particular piece of land. However, it has long been considered a sister species to Antarctica. Unlike Belgica, one fundamentally important difference is that it is parthenogenetic. That means only females are known. It's quite an important aspect of biology. It was subsequent to its discovery, it was introduced to Signy Island in the maritime Antarctic, and so it's an introduced alien species there. Like Belgica, it's the largest terrestrial animal present in that ecosystem. It is invasive there, and it's an ecosystem engineer. That process of decomposition I mentioned, the larvae of this fly can increase it by an order of magnitude relative to the entire decomposition achieved by the native invertebrate community. So you can see that functionally, these things can be important. In terms of its physiology, also studied in some detail, it has the potential to survive on the Antarctic Peninsula if it ever gets there. And because it's asexual, it can reproduce more rapidly and over a longer timescale than Belgica, which has to emerge and find mates. That means it could possibly outcompete Belgica. There is a potential biological threat there. The final point, I've been sort of not saying explicitly to this point, but it is an important one. Molecular studies actually indicate that although this thing is called Eretmotra as a genus, it is actually, in molecular terms, a member of the genus Belgica. And this rather small chart at the right indicates where the members of, how the members of Belgica are related to each other. All of these ones at the bottom are Belgica Antarctica from various parts of the Antarctic Peninsula. This big group here is Belgica albipes, which is a species on the Crozet archipelago, Session Island. Remember that map earlier on. And this little offshoot here, which is definitely part of this group, is Eretmotra, South Georgia. So yes, we actually have one real Belgica, other than Antarctica. We've got albipes. We have one that should be a Belgica, Motra, and we have one that was a Belgica and is now called Telmatogeta. We've got a whole group of these things. So bringing that together, it has to be a rapid talk. This was actually a rapid talk. But where do we go next? What has happened over the century and more since Emil Racoviță made these discoveries of small, seemingly unexciting invertebrates in this extreme? Over a century after its first discovery, Belgica Antarctica itself is essential, has been described as a model organism for research in multiple disciplines of extreme environment research, particularly related to stress tolerance responses. This research, or research underpinning its ecological, biochemical, physiological adaptations to environmental stress, is now giving foundation to the application of multiple omics techniques. Everyone's heard of genomics, also transcriptomics, metabolomics, all sorts of things. Now, Belgica is being used at the leading edge of this type of study. The genomic studies I mentioned and other omic studies focusing on Belgica and the other species I've mentioned and other close relatives are actually leading a sort of revolution in teasing apart evolutionary processes and adaptations to environmental extremes. Now, the sort of phylogenetic trees I put up, the maps I put up, they get combined into a discipline called phylogeography, which is molecular biogeography, basically. And studies trying to understand evolutionary divergence, current and past distributions, colonization history. These studies of Belgica and its various sister species are and will greatly increase understanding of Antarctic biological history. They also have a very important cross-fertilization with glaciological research. Glaciologists are trying to better define the history of Antarctic ice sheet extent. Plainly through the Pleistocene, that varied widely through glacial maxima, glacial minima. But the fact that we have endemic species like Belgica living in these areas mean that there has been terrestrial habitat available throughout that time. That's a very important conclusion to draw. And if we know the timescale on which Belgica has been in those habitats, and we know the molecular relationships between Belgica from different parts of their overall distribution, we can start pointing to where ice-free ground must have remained even at glacial maximum. And that gives a sort of biological constraint for where you can put ice. Finally, we're obviously in an era of climate change, vast amount of publicity and research applied to that. Work on species like Belgica, data from multiple disciplines, are vital for predicting future species distributions. Will Belgica's distribution change? Will other species colonize the Antarctic Peninsula? Will they compete with it? And so on. All of this is vital for developing effective future Antarctic conservation strategies. That I say. What I will say is this is just touching a scratch. It's a very big field of research. Everything I've said is drawn from a series of reviews over the last 25 years that have documented the state of research on these, not necessarily specifically Belgica, the top one is specifically Belgica, but also the insects and some of the other arthropods that occur in the Antarctic region. So these are 3 review papers. And as a first instance for anybody who wants to go any further, I would point you at these papers as very good literature sources of different disciplines of this research. So at that point, I will thank you very much. I do hope you don't have to listen to this, and I do get to the meeting in person. But I hope you're having a very good meeting, whether I'm there or not. So thank you very much.
Peter was not available to join us. He probably didn't make his flight, but we thank him for this presentation that sort of wrapped up this story that we started 125 years ago. It's a story of time from 125 years ago to molecular clocks today. Also a story across space from deep Earth to all the way to outer space, as shown. And a story of expertise that involves absolutely everybody, not just scientists, but technology, engineers, sailors, crew, everybody, and everybody else. And this is so beautifully represented in this group of people that join us today, that we all span across space and time zones all across the globe. And thank you, everybody, for joining us, especially people from New York, Carol Smith, Julian Santon, Olivia and Charlotte from joining us from Belgium, Penny from joining us from New Mexico. And so what I am hoping is this is just the first of a series of many, many conversations that are to be continued. We're looking forward to ideas of what do you see a collaboration going forward. And I wanted to, if I may, just leave you with a little bit of a testament. Let's see if I can share my screen. Of Emil Racoviță. Actually, about the expedition, the words he wrote in Towards the South were a little bit about what he described that they discovered, the ocean basin, a new strait and lands, terrestrial fauna and flora from a land that was not known at the time, year-round set of meteorological observations. And he ends with the fact, with the complete awareness that this was not a lot. Compared to a global scale, he thinks this was not a lot. And he says, indeed, it is very little, and we are aware of this is true. What I really liked about his approach, he really understood this time scale of how nothing can be done unless you look both back in time at the great predecessors that basically paved the way. And also we need to pave the way to our future colleagues. And this idea that all research and exploration needs to come from the common desire to grow the common good of humanity. And I liked his lay terms about the expedition. Once there were only 19 people who left for Antarctica on a small and shaky ship to explore the South Pole. They were neither wealthy, nor powerful, nor famous. but they were aware of what they were going to do, and they knew what was awaiting for them. And once there, they made mistakes and they were subject to human weaknesses, but they worked as well as they could, and they did all that they could. And only 17 came back, telling themselves that their deaths of their dear companions and their own suffering will not have been in vain, that they could add a little stone to the building of science, to that source of light, of truth, and of justice that guides humanity towards better times. And now we know that in that place of truth, everything has a place: science, writing, art, and the collection of data. So with this, I would like to close this meeting, and we can probably stop the recording, but if you wish to stay on for a short table discussion, if you wish to share anything, and actually say hello to many people that we meet online for the first time, and also goodbye, we can keep the meeting open for a little longer. Jona, you can stop the recording if you wish. So we can move into just a short roundtable if you wish to share anything, or if there's anything from anybody about what we would like to do next together. So yes, we actually, we do thank deeply to the Romanian Academy, to the university that has been hosting this, to all the team and administrative staff from the Faculty of Biology and Geology and the Faculty of Geography, and the Clever Media and Revista Natura, and the organizers of this meeting, and literally to all the speakers who so kindly sent presentation and spent time to put things together to honor Emil Racoviță in this week of his both birth and death. He was born on November 15 and passed on November 19, but what matters, what people say, what matters is the journey in between the 2 points. It's not when he was born and not when he died, but it's the journey. So it's the legacy of his life journey, as well as the journey of and the lives of his companions that were with him all along the way. So I promise that we will keep in touch. We'll write to each other again. And unless somebody else.
No, just thank you very much for organizing. This was a real pleasure.
Julian, it's such a delight that you wrote the book, and I'm really looking forward to keeping in touch with you and doing more and mining the data, and also with Olivier and with Carol. There is so much data to be mined in our documents that will for sure get back in touch.
Absolutely. See you in Romania.
Yes, absolutely. We will host you.
we recommend the book of Julian Sancton.
Merci beaucoup.
Because we have both screen, but we were impressed by the work of Julian, who make a lot of research, make a very interesting and correct analysis of the character of the people, and that's quite important to understand the psychology of everybody. And he made a wonderful book. And if anybody asks me what book to read about the Belgica expedition, we will always say the book of Julian Sancton. Okay, and many thanks for your fantastic program. We were very interested also on the presentation on the cave and the future and the other asteroid. It's really interesting. Thank you for the next time. Bye.
Thank you. We wish everybody a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll see each other soon.